Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
Early in the morning, Vanessa slipped out of bed, trying not to make any noise, threw a robe over her shoulders, her own draught, and quietly walked out of the bedroom. Nick the coal was nothing. My husband always opened the window at night, even if there was a crackling pile outside the window and frost in the stuffiness he couldn't sleep. And when Vanessa complained that she was freezing, he only laughed and advised her to cover herself with a second blanket. Vanessa closed the bathroom door tightly behind her and touched the radiator. It was barely warm, which meant she'd have to wait for the water to flow so she could warm herself under the shower. The plain blue tile nodded in the light of the bowl. Vanessa had spent an hour yesterday scrubbing it with a sponge. Nick didn't like the smudges and drip marks. Opening the hot water faucet, Vanessa was convinced that her suspicions were correct and needed to wait until the water swirled downward, swirling into a funnel to travel on. The woman washed her face. Only then did she gingerly glance in the mirror for 35 years. Not going anywhere. No, Vanessa looked very good for her age, except that her husband Nick joked about the wrinkles that were increasingly flickering near her eyes and about her slight fullness with which she was struggling. Vanessa, where could I get such a beauty? If you were married, Sebastian said, I'd marry her, he said. The technologist at Vanessa's factory was embarrassed and blushed. You say Sebastian too. There are so many young and thin. Why do I need power? The man wondered. There must be a woman. And then he drew intricate curves in the air. Vanessa laughed and ran off to her department. She worked as a teacher in a furniture factory and met her husband there. He was a chauffeur, delivering freight. She immediately liked the tall, handsome guy. On one of the Subotniks they were put together. Vanessa collected wet, entangled leaves in a pile, and Nick loaded them onto a wheelbarrow and drove them to the tractor. Music was playing. The sun was warm and thin cobwebs were hanging in the air, and you heard a cheerful shout. Vanessa and Nick turned around at the same time. That's how Peter the photographer took the picture for the local newspaper. Vanessa, with a round face and dimples on her cheeks, looked surprised with big gray eyes and light blonde strands of hair poking out from under her shawl. And Nick, black, bald, swarthy, looking like a gypsy, smiles. Vanessa admired him from the sidelines, and even when he asked her out on a date, she couldn't believe that Nick had paid attention to her. He was a bit rough, but Vanessa, who had grown up without a father, felt happy. Let it be only walks in the park or a modest bouquet of daisies bought from a grandmother on the street. Let not say beautiful words and not carried in his arms around the house, but with him Vanessa felt protected. That's why she agreed to marry him without a second thought. When Nick blushed, so that it was visible on his swarthy cheeks, awkwardly muttered Ver. We should get married. It's not for the apartments. Of course, Vanessa went after Nick. It would have been paradise with him in the family dorm room. She just felt safe and comfortable with him. Not a talkative and homely, he didn't run every weekend to the garages where the men gathered with beer. He saved his paycheck, opened a deposit, wanted to save up for a car. They lived mostly on their paychecks. But how much do the two of them need? It's just the two of them. Vanessa is squinting with happiness. But soon there will be 3 of us, and then we'll have 4. Not young people, they're green. It's time to think about children. Vanessa looked with a slight envy at her friends who already had babies. She wanted a son like Nick, and then a daughter, and to be like her. We had a modest wedding. Nick's parents died at logging in the Taita. His aunt raised him. But she died when he went into the army, and Vanessa had only her mom. But she lived far away in a small Siberian village, where you can't get out of at once. She sent a congratulatory telegram and told me to come to visit, to get acquainted with my son-in-law. Does he treat you well, Vanessa? Does not raise his hand, does not drink and look, will behave badly, immediately divorce and come back here. I'll always be there for you. We'll think of something. Mommy Vanessa wiped away her tears. Mommy, sweet mommy. Almost forcibly put her on a train after the 10th grade and sent her to a faraway land so that her daughter could study at a technical college. Stabbed and sold a piglet. Yes, all her life she's been saving and denying herself everything. Dreamed that Vanessa lived and worked in the city and not mud in the village. And still warm anger, soul from the realization of how much her mother loves her. It's been 10 years since the wedding. Vanessa fulfilled her mother's instruction and on her first vacation went with Nick to her ancestral home. She hoped Betty would be a mom to him too. After all, he had been orphaned so young. But it didn't happen. They couldn't find a common ground. Nick couldn't accept the country life. I'm here on vacation, not to work. He grumbled, collapsing in the garden on an old bed, covered with a blanket. And here you are with your fences and roofs. He did something poorly, but only because he heard the gossip of his neighbors. They laughed at him, and the men looked at him with curiosity. He's strange. He doesn't drink with them and keeps to himself, and he doesn't help around the house. And Betty was waiting for her son-in-law, bragging that the helper would come. The neighbors never abandoned her, always shoveling snow and fetching water. Betty herself is still vigorous, even though she's old. Vanessa tried to have a nice talk with Nick, but he just got gloomier. And then he stopped talking to her altogether. Stay out of it, daughter. Mom stroked Vanessa's shoulder. Such an unaccustomed person growing up in the city. Vanessa was grateful that her mother did not reproach her, but looked her in the eye as always gently and lovingly. Then I couldn't go home every year. Nick wasn't happy. Vanessa cried and fretted, but she was afraid to contradict her husband. If she left alone, she felt guilty. She didn't have a baby in a year or two. The doctor in the consultation only waved her hands and advised her husband to be examined. But as soon as Vanessa mentioned it, Nick became furious, raised his face at her, white with anger, and hissed, "I'm the one with the problem. Are you going to tell me to go to the doctor?" No, Vanessa struggled from the mountains and flipped quietly. "But Nick, the doctor says both of you need to get checked out. There's nothing wrong with me. You're on your own." Nick scolds and unfolds a fresh newspaper. Mom hid her illness for a long time. She kept writing that her health was good. She promised to pack up and come and visit. She tried not to worry Vanessa like thunder. A telegram sent by the neighbors fell out of the clear sky. It was necessary to go to the funeral. Nick hesitated for a long time, but did not dare to refuse. It was his wife's grief after all. And what would people say? Vanessa was barely torn from the grave with a victorious face, clung to the loose clay, stroked her mother's portrait without stopping. Her mother's house had to be sold almost for nothing, and Nick took the money for himself. By that time, he thought of exchanging the one-room apartment for a two-room one. He wanted space and a separate bedroom. He got the furniture from the factory, bypassing the stores. Vanessa brought coziness and beauty, and all dreamed of how well the crib would stand in the bedroom so that the draft would not affect. But still the house remained without the cry of children and the stomping of little feet. Well, nothing, as something that lived, worked on weekends, went to the movies, and in the evenings watched TV. Only more and more painfully pinches the heart when on the screen saw happy parents with children, and the whole yard, and in winter and summer counted children's voices. "I don't know what's the matter," waved his hands another doctor. "According to the tests, you're fine." Vanessa lowered her head and walked home, purposely making a detour so as not to pass the kindergarten. "Cole, maybe we'll take it from the baby house." And she once dared Nick. He threw the newspaper, shoved it into his bare feet, and jumped up in his slippers with a hole in the big toe. "Never by Krasnikov," he retorted. "I'll never bring up a bastard. And you get that shit out of your head." "But Nick, there are kids like that out there," almost whispered Vanessa. "You can take a little one. He won't even know he's not his own." "Vanessa, you seem to be a grown woman, but you talk such nonsense. Our normal children surrendered to the state. No, we don't know who his parents were, and you're in the house. What a Mother Teresa." Anyway, I never heard that again. Every month, Vanessa lived for a few days in hope. Listened to herself, caught fleeting changes, rejoiced. If she pulled a thin or slightly older no ox, but all in vain. Nothing was happening. In the end, I almost resigned myself to it. What can you do? It's fate. And yet, pressing her lips with resentment, squinted at the neighbor from the first floor. 100 large broken woman yard no one's high gave birth, almost every year, and all from different men. It seems that she herself no longer remembered how many offspring she had. The older ones had moved away. Others lived in a boarding school and came only on weekends. And the little ones she quickly put in a 24-hour kindergarten for 5 days. And still she was always seen by the old fiddler and Nick and a couple of 3 children. And Vanessa cried nights praying to the sky for the one and only. Nina, a faithful friend, consoled Vanessa as best she could. "Don't cry, tears can't help." Once, looking sympathetically in her face, she told her friend, "Listen, you and Nick are getting divorced. I think it's about him. Why doesn't he go to the doctors? I couldn't get pregnant the first year. My William ran like a sweetheart." Vanessa laughed through her tears. Nina was round, important, and cozy like a toothpick. She was beautiful. Huge black eyes, bright lips, and a loud voice, which was feared by her husband and 2 children. And her husband William was narrow-shouldered, but he idolized his wife and obeyed her in everything. Nina was only stern in appearance, but in fact she loved her William and Jacob dearly, and capricious with a twig who grew up a complete copy of her mother. "Or go to the resort," spun the affair and continued Nina, flashing her eyes. Nina reproachfully interrupted her. "Vanessa, you know I can't do that." "I know," Nina said sadly, propping up her cheek with a rotten fist. She looked at her friend sympathetically, not knowing how to help her, and Vanessa was grateful for that warmth. Now, standing in the bathroom in front of the mirror, it was as if Vanessa saw all 10 years she had lived with Nick. Gazed into gray eyes with dark lashes. Cautiously, she peered at the wrinkles in his brow and frowned again. Cares came up, not before memories. In 3 days, she leaves for the sanatorium. It is necessary to have time to cook and freeze Nick cutlets, porcelain peppers, to doku parovani macaroni, to order that cheese to take only in a distant store on the avenue not adapted to the household. Nick was used to having the whole household run on Vanessa alone. So he resented her when she told him about the trip. "Why do you want it? Why do you want to go to resorts?" "Not resorts. Nick, it's medical treatment." Vanessa was justifying herself. "Are you sick? Aren't you? Just say so. Do you want a vacation from home?" He was offended. Molly was running around in the accounting department. She was glowing with happiness and couldn't get pregnant for a long time. And then she went to a new sanatorium. She faked the procedures and got treated with mud. And now she's going on maternity leave. Vanessa caught Molly outside the cafeteria. Blushing, she asked Molly what was going on. And then she was determined to see a doctor. "Try it, Vanessa." "Of course you will. I'll get the papers ready." So for the first time in years, Vanessa decided to go somewhere alone without her husband. At first, she thought he wouldn't let her go at all. But Nick grumbled a little and calmed it down. "All right, go ahead. But I don't want to go to a diner for food. I'll get heartburn later." Vanessa took a shower, looked sadly at her imperfect body and sighed. Not only the extra 7 kilograms were not going away, but also the emptiness. But there was no time to grieve. She had to make breakfast for Nick. Vanessa hung up the towel and hurried to the kitchen. It wasn't a long drive. In the morning, Vanessa took the train, and in 24 hours she was to arrive in a small, cozy town, where the sanatorium was located in a picturesque forest. There were few things with her. Nick had not been able to organize it. It was necessary to go to work after breakfast. He awkwardly pecked Vanessa on the cheek and jokingly punished her. "Watch what you're looking at." Vanessa looked at her husband in surprise, who suddenly wagged his finger at her in embarrassment. On the train, Vanessa settled down on the bottom shelf and at once moved to the window to watch how trains of brick booths, shining Putin rails would pass by. And then forests, small villages, towns, meadows, and bridges over rivers would begin. It was late autumn. The trees had already thrown off their colorful attire, and now their legs were frowning. Patiently they waited for winter to approach them and leave its white blanket on their shoulders. It was warm in the wagon. The neighbors were an old woman who was carefully sat down by some woman, probably her daughter. One of the upper shelves was empty, and on the other one a talkative and frowning man, as it seemed to me, laid down at the very beginning of the journey. All day long he slept and went downstairs. Only towards evening he took a towel and went to the restroom. He returned after living with invited water in his hair. Vanessa noted that his hair was not exactly gray, but mixed with black. And it was very unusual, as if the ground was sown with gray ash. "You excuse me," the man suddenly smiled. "I slept all day. I was sent on a business trip, and straight from the night shift," he continued to justify himself. Vanessa was surprised, seeing what difference it makes, but the man sleeps and sleeps. He doesn't disturb her, he doesn't bother her with conversations. He doesn't spill beer in a glass, doesn't suck on it. It's a fairy tale. "It's all right though," she replied. "It's good to sleep well on the train. That's for sure." The man was smiling again, and Vanessa noted how he had transformed, as if 10 years dropped from the corner of the ray and wrinkles, and gray eyes almost like hers warmed up. "My name is John. What's yours?" Vanessa answered Vanessa and turned away to the window. By that time it had already gotten dark and only occasional white lights floated behind the glass. The blurred figures of the passengers were reflected. "Oh, so I'm your father's namesake." Vanessa fixed her hair and said simply, "Yes, I guess you are. Only I've never seen him." Why did John embarrassedly waved his hands? All sorts of things happen in life. Yes, it happens. They were silent, turned back to the wall long ago slept old woman. On the table nodded a glass under the glasses. Vanessa suddenly became so unbearably sad. Where was she going? Why? Wanted to go home to Nick in familiar surroundings. "Let's have some tea." Her new acquaintance clapped his hands quietly. "And Vanessa, you want a cuppa? I love cuppa. In the evening I have fresh cookies." "Wife baked?" asked Vanessa with a smile. No, not my wife bought fresh ones from the buffet this morning." So I then to the conductor. He looked into her eyes pleadingly, and she herself do not know why she agreed. It was embarrassing to refuse, and I wanted something hot. Of course, you can't have a sweet tooth at night. But then again, Nick isn't here. No one will grumble, whose in the beginning did not want to sleep for a long time. The cookies did turn out to be delicious. Not deceived, in the cafeteria sat, talking in low voices. John told how he was widowed 5 years ago and lives alone with his son. As a teenager, he works at a ball and a workshop, traveling on business trips, passing on his experience. And his son is looked after by a neighbor. Vanessa listened attentively. She liked how sing-songy the man's voice sounded, as if a stormy stream washes away pebbles. John she felt sorry for one who was not sweet. She said almost nothing about herself, shared only that she was going to a sanatorium for 3 weeks, and the children were at home with their father. John asked. Vanessa was embarrassed, shook her head, and then suddenly said angrily, "It's late, it's time to go to bed," and on the right side of the pillow she began to untangle her long, thick hair from the knot. "Do you, Vanessa, look like a mermaid?" John said quietly, and a gentle note trembled in his voice. Vanessa answered nothing. Noisily she settled down, covered herself with a sheet with a scratchy blanket on top, and turned her back to the wall. Lied without moving, listening. John sighed heavily with the squeak of his boots and went into the vestibule. There for a long time he looked out the dark window and thought about something of his own. Early in the morning everyone was awakened by the conductress. All yesterday's lightness, with which Vanessa communicated with John, suddenly vanished. Vanessa was confused, took out a suitcase from under the shelf and froze, cross-legged, looking at the unfamiliar station to which the train was approaching. "Vanessa, I apologize if I offended you." Then yesterday suddenly said John. "We are from the same city. I wrote down my work phone number here. You never know. Don't think anything bad of him." He was in a hurry. His voice was soft but insistent. Vanessa fit, but she took the paper. Uncomfortable to offend a man she had no trouble with. A glimpse of the number. At the bottom, John Brunson was written in handwriting. The train jerked and stopped. Vanessa smiled politely and, saying a quick goodbye, began to make her way down the corridor. John stepped onto the platform when Vanessa was no longer on it. The sanatorium turned out to be very large, consisting of several buildings. Vanessa looked around confusedly, noticing the signpost, headed towards the main building. They took her in quickly. They checked the voucher and documents. Vanessa filled in the questionnaire and, having received a sheet with the schedule of the day and procedures, went to the room. After lunch, she had to visit the doctor to draw up a treatment plan. They put her on the third floor. Vanessa walked down the soft red carpet, peering into the rooms at the identical light brown doors. Here twirled one in her hand. The key knocked just in case. Footsteps sounded inside, and the door swung open. In the doorway froze a tall, curly-haired blonde woman. She looked to be in her early 30s, wearing a short, pink, and cool robe, with slender, long legs peeking out from underneath. The woman knew she was good and was happy to show it off. "Hello." Vanessa smiled welcomingly. "And I'm your neighbor, Vanessa." The blonde measured her with her gaze and then smiled broadly. Vanessa noted what large white teeth she had, like a horse's. She thought and was immediately embarrassed. Why would she say that about a stranger? "Hello," the woman said. "Hello," she said. "And I was wondering who would move in with me. I was afraid not to be some country aunt, or the whole room would be lost with cows." She laughed. Vanessa cautiously went inside. The room had 2 wooden beds, 2 nightstands, a small table by the wall, some chairs. The windows were tightly closed, and the room was warm, even stuffy. Vanessa was glad. So her roommate wasn't a walrus like Nick. "My name is Lucy. Here's your bed. Where did you come from? What kind of treatments have you been smoking?" The neighbor was nonstop. Vanessa didn't have time to answer questions. Lucy, she seemed to like her looseness, and seemed too talkative and intrusive. They were surprised to learn that they were both from the same town. Lucy worked at the local history museum as an administrator, but dreamed of a higher position. "Oh, in 10 minutes it's lunchtime," Lucy sang, glancing at the tiny watch on her arm. "Come on, I'll show you around." "The food here isn't very good," screamed her pretty face. Blue and round, doll-like eyes. The black mole above her upper lip twitched nervously. "Useful Aline, I've adapted to going to the park nearby in the evenings. You can walk there and have a shish kebab or a big cheburek." Vanessa looked at Lucy's figure with slight envy. Slim, trim, not a gram of extra. "And it is possible, and a cheburek." "And you on what profile to treat?" "On the female part," unceremoniously asked Lucy, when they, having opened umbrellas, went along the wet paths to the dining room. Vanessa blushed and nodded silently. "Come on, not everyone is cured. You'll be as good as new." "Really?" Vanessa asked naively and childishly. If only it could come true, if only it could come true, she thought, looking up at the low, frowning sky. Lucy liked the open sky, and she's not one to mince words. Ever modest and quiet, Vanessa was glad her neighbor was so forward. Maybe they would become friends and continue to communicate when they returned from the sanatorium. "I wonder if Lucy would like Nina." "How long have you been here?" Vanessa asked. "A new friend for 10 days now. It's important," Lucy nodded. "To be honest, I'm sick of both the mud and the charcut shower. And they don't let me sleep in the morning for gymnastics. I'm thinking of going home early. I'll stay another week," and she waved her hand as if she was dancing. "I missed my husband." Vanessa smiled understandingly. "I just left and I miss him already." She confessed. "You can say the same about your husband." "I haven't found someone to drag me to the registry office yet," she said proudly. Although as Lucy threw her arms around him as if she wanted to hug someone. Vanessa smiled. It was the first time she'd seen a woman who didn't want to get married. She felt so grown-up and solid next to her. Had she had children at all, she might have looked at her condescendingly. "I do have a friend, though." Lucy smiled slyly. "I have a heart for him." "And him." "Careful," Vanessa asked. Lucy raised a painted, perfectly straight eyebrow, and he is not indifferent either. "Ehe, she loves it," she says really. "We don't get to see each other often, but when we do, it's a blast. He and I are even in the car," she giggled embarrassedly. A delicate blush appeared on her cheeks. Sasha's blonde curls bounced merrily in time with her steps. The rain was getting heavier and heavier, drumming on umbrellas, on roofs, and knocking glass off thin branches. The last leaves were adorned with scarlet bunches of mountain ash. Large drops of days flowed smoothly one after another. Vanessa diligently followed all the doctor's recommendations. She had made a wish she would come and everything should definitely work out. That's why she got up early in the morning and went to the big gym for gymnastics. Lucy was asleep at that time, covered in blankets. Then Vanessa would shower and together with Clara, they would go to breakfast. Lucy angrily swished gray oatmeal around on her plate and threatened to pack her suitcase right now and leave. I in the morning toast under the roast I like and coffee they this junk. It's dreary, she said. Vanessa obediently ate whatever was served, not complaining. After breakfast, Vanessa walked in matted circles around the buildings and said hello to the other patients. Lucy lay in her room on her bed and leafed through Maud's magazine. The doctor's recommendations were quickly boring her. I came here for a vacation, not for treatment. She sighed, flapping her thickly painted lashes. Vanessa was amazed. Lucy put on her makeup early in the morning and walked around like that all day. And in the evening she put on glittery shadows because she had to make a promenade down the boulevard. Her slim figure in a gray coat looked like a mannequin, and especially attracted attention pink shoes on a neat heel-like. Through acquaintances got polished carelessly, said Lucy, noticing the admiring looks of Vanessa. And the money helped my favorite. Do you know what he is like? Lucy rolled his eyes and pressed his hands to his heart. Vanessa chuckled good-naturedly. It was good when people had feelings. Several times Lucy asked Vanessa to come along, but she always refused. Come on, I've been married for 100 years. You'd be bored with me. She stayed in her room. She read a book she borrowed from the library when she arrived. Lucy came back early one day, nodding with brightly painted eyes, and locked the door. Vanessa sat up, picking her feet up on the bed. Lucy, smiling mysteriously, winked and pointed with her eyes at the table, then took a bottle of whiskey out of the polyethylene of the new bag and set it on the field flat with a light clatter. Vanessa raised her eyebrows in surprise. Sit down, friend, let's have a drink. Let's talk about ours, about women's things. Look how beautiful it is. Lucy stepped to the bed, turned the bag over, and 3 orange balls rolled out on the bedspread. Oranges, Vanessa exclaimed. She splashed her hands in amazement. Lucy reached into her purse and pulled out a bar of bitter chocolate. She shook it in the air like a prize of deliciousness at the come on, throw your book. Vanessa shook her head. What, Pilar? I don't like that. Yeah, and I'm not allowed to have the same procedures. Lucy laughed, and without saying another word, paying off the bottle splashed some into the glasses. She took an orange and started peeling it. The air smelled festively of New Year's Eve. Drowsy broke a chocolate bar into pieces. Please, Lucy made an inviting gesture, and Vanessa realized she wouldn't take no for an answer. Well, a little can do, she agreed, afraid of offending her friend. The Serbian liquid adored her tongue. Vanessa wrinkled her nose and reached for the orange slices. The juicy, flavorful pulp pleasantly filled her mouth. Her cheeks lit up and felt hot. Lucy was already developing a new portion. No matter how much Vanessa resisted, she had to drink it, and her head was already a little dizzy. Do you like it? Unexpectedly, Lucy asked and looked at Vanessa point blank. Who was Vanessa afraid of? Well, her husband. Lucy laughed. Vanessa thought about it. For some reason, all sorts of silly things came into her head. She remembered the annoying quarrels and Nick's rudeness. His accusations that it was her fault they didn't have children. Vanessa was offended, and word by word she suddenly began to complain to Lucy. She listened, sighing attentively. Again Savala poured whiskey in Vanessa's hand, a chocolate bar, which melted and unpleasantly stained her finger. It was especially bitter to talk about how the baby wasn't working out, and Vanessa even cried. Lucy consoled, saying that all men are selfish. She brought V, her favorite, who even though and money tosses and shakes all the passion, but all the same does not call for marriage. So if you don't want to get married, Vanessa remembered. The light bulbs on the ceiling were going on for some reason, and she blinked a few times to focus on not wanting to. Shook Kadria shove Lucy, no, I do. Suddenly she howled, and he crept through the curtains into the room. Timidly piqued, Luna looked coldly at the 2 women, who had long since slept, and on the table was a bottle of not-too-pit whiskey. Yes, slipped orange crusts as bitter as a woman's tears. The next morning, Vanessa woke up with a headache and couldn't even go to gymnastics. She remembered how Lucy had complained and wrinkled her nose at the whiskey bottle and couldn't even look at it. She was cursing herself. She'd never had a drink before. Good thing Nick wouldn't know what she'd been doing. Suddenly, she felt terribly ashamed. And Lucy acted as if nothing had happened, laughing, teasing Vanessa's green face, and urging her to go for a walk to feel better. And then the next day, all of a sudden, they were going home. "Lucy, what about it? Why don't you stay a little longer?" But Lucy shook her curls. "No, I'm bored to death. I'll go. I've got better things to do." I had Vanessa, and she was upset, and in her heart she was glad. But it was the broken neighbor that made her uncomfortable. Vanessa is not used to such communication. "Lucy Chernoff, there's a piece of paper with the museum's phone number on it. Call me when you get back. Don't get lost." Vanessa nodded and hugged Lucy. She decided to hide the note in her purse so she wouldn't lose it. Her fingers came across a folded rectangle with John's phone number written on it. Vanessa twirled the paper in her hands and smiled, but for some reason she didn't throw it away, but carefully put it back. After Lucy left, no one else had been assigned to Vanessa. She was glad of that. One thing was good and calm for her. She still diligently followed all the recommendations of the doctors and did not break the regimen anymore. Each mud bath, each spoonful of dietary food brought her closer to the cherished day when she would have a child. She missed Nick and thought of him with a smile. And he wasn't rude at all. She was wrong, Lucy, she chattered, just a serious man. No bluster. When she comes back, she'll be stronger and fresher. She'll bring him a present, a blue shirt bought from gypsies, and everything will be fine. And they'll have a son, or a daughter. 4 days before the departure of the sanatorium, the alarming news swept across the sanatorium. One of the buildings was closed for quarantine, and all the vacationers were advised to take tests and leave. Vanessa did so and did not need to be among infections. She did not need to be healthy. She was worried that she wouldn't be able to exchange her ticket. But even here she was lucky. She found a seat on the train. True, for Bykov. But Vanessa didn't care about that. Her heart was quickly going home and home to the beat of the wheels. Nick will be surprised. Maybe he'll take some time off. And then they would spend 3 more days together going to the movies or visiting the museum where Lucy worked. Vanessa fleetingly thought of John. Where is he now? She remembered the delicious cookies he used to treat her to. She sighed furtively. She hadn't lost any weight at the sanitarium. She'd wanted to surprise Nick, but it was nothing. The main thing was to have a baby. Now she's old. It's scary to have your first baby when your friends have taller kids. It's embarrassing. I was kind of scared of these thoughts and chased them away. Let her have it at 35. She'll grow up. Only God forbid. Shrunken City met her glumly, not affectionately, with icy fingers reaching for the collar of her coat. The wind blew a fine frost in her face, and puddles covered with fall leaves prepared their traps. Vanessa looked around as if searching for someone. Although she realized that there was no one to meet her, she decided not to bother her husband with a telegram, but to give him a pleasant surprise. He must have missed her too. There was no bus for a long time. Vanessa was talking about something else, hiding behind the tin wall of the bus stop from the wind. Her hands and the tip of her nose were red, and Vanessa dreamed of only one thing: to get home soon and get drunk. Hot tea was not enough to fall apart. Finally, the desired room arrived, and Vanessa happily settled down close to the driver's cabin. There was a pleasant warmth from there. The ride was good. The cabin was almost empty. It was too early, even for the working man Nick. Gradually warmed Vanessa's fingers. Suddenly the bus jerked, and Vanessa abruptly opened her eyes. Did it really pass? Did she breathe a sigh of relief? No, she woke up just in time. On the next exit, he stood up in advance and holding her leg. The suitcase clutched at the spoilers. Cold winds surrounded around for 3, and with the bare branches of trees, knocking large drops off them, Vanessa put with nothing. Now we'll run to the corner, and there into the yard and already home. Here is the entrance with a wet wooden bench, on which there are no leaves left and only bunches of bright red berries shivering. Vanessa breathed in the warm smell of the basement. Air habitually looked in the mailbox and grabbed the newspaper that had been forgotten there. Nick must still be asleep. Vanessa smiled and hurried upstairs. If there's any kefir at home, pancakes will pass us now. She anticipated, hurriedly walking up the stairs. Suitcase uncomfortable, kicked at her feet, inserted the key into the keyhole, pushed the door. The hallway was half dark. The apartment was sleepily quiet. Vanessa carefully set the suitcase on the floor, unbuttoned his coat, and pulled the handkerchief off his head. "Whew, good, I'm home at last," she whispered, stumbling quietly in the morning light over something on the floor. Nick must have scattered his shoes again. Never puts them back where they belong. I shook my head and turned on the light. The bulb flashed brightly in a milky white background. Dumbfounded, Vanessa looked under her feet as if she had seen a poisonous snake. She shifted her confused gaze to the coat rack and stared at the gray coat, hung right over Nick's jacket. Her eyes slid down again. Flirty and pink booties stood in front of her. On a small heel, Vanessa pressed both palms to her mouth as if she was afraid to scream. Her heart pounding, so much so that her ears were ringing. Vanessa stood still as if petrified. Her knees shook nastily, and in her stomach something rumbled and shrank. It was the kind of coat and boots worn by Lucy, her neighbor at the sanitarium. Vanessa sank heavily onto the bench at the entrance. Carefully she pushed aside the shoes, the frivolous, denigrating color. Her head was buzzing and exploding, and there was no strength to go further into the apartment. I couldn't cry either. It was as if a knot had been tied inside. Suddenly there was a loud drip of water from the faucet in the kitchen, and that sound brought Vanessa out of her stupor. She stood up abruptly and staggered down the padded walkway to the bedroom door. Her heart threw out somersaults converged in a frenzied dance. Vanessa closed her eyes. For a moment, she thought she was still on the train, sleeping on her side and having an ugly and very unpleasant dream. Now she would wake up and none of this was there. But reality was inexorable. Here were the pink shoes, here were the wooden doors, and behind her it was disgusting to even think about it. Still, she pushed the door open with trembling fingers. The bedroom curtains were tightly wrapped, and so Vanessa did not immediately see who was lying there. In her and Nick's bed, the room was stuffy and smelled of a familiar, sweetly taken perfume. For some reason, this time Nick crawled off the tightly padded window. Her eyes were slowly adjusting, and Vanessa silently prayed to herself. To who? That all this would turn out to be a world, her fiction, a mistake. She looked at the pile of blankets on the bed, and there was only Nick, disgruntled at being woken up early. Reality proved inexorable in the rare bedroom light. Vanessa discerned and chornelled her husband's head and the curly head of Lucy, who slept soundly with her nose tucked into Nick's shoulder. Virus vomited, spasming, stomach twisting so that she gasped in pain. Collapse, I don't think, not with lice in my eyes. The room on the table, careless as a rag, hung Lucy's dress, and Nick's pants were lying on the floor in a shapely lump. A black stocking on the rug by the bed appeared as a snake. Vanessa scrambled as if she were in danger. A champagne bottle rolled and swirled on the floor with a loud clatter. Lucy hissed and pulled at the hoarse, holy voice of Nick. Nick, something rattling. Nick fell silent and opened his eyes unhappily. Noticing Vanessa, he pulled himself onto her as if he had seen a ghost. Vanessa mumbled behind him. He twisted his head perplexedly in the halls of the car. His eyes were running and his hands frantically clutched at the blanket next to his shoulder V-cup on the blonde curls. Ashik Vanessa met her gaze with Lucy's round as saucer's eyes. There was a look of horror in them. Lucy silently, moving her lips in panic, shifting her gaze from Vanessa to Nick. Vanessa, it's me here, you know, fussing over all this. Lucy remained silent, clutching the blanket to her chest. Vanessa didn't utter a sound either, only leaned helplessly against her pigtail, pouring out from behind a nasty squealing dog barking at the neighbor behind the wall. Vanessa turned away and sprinted out of the bedroom. Swallowing her tears, she ran through the wet streets, turning down walks without making out the road. Stumbled over stones thrown in the way, hoped like a blind kitten into unfamiliar yards, finally stopped and slowly looked around. Everything was as usual, hurrying to work. People were running patriarchs to the Iranians, to school. Kids walking their dogs, old ladies. The world had not collapsed. Everyone had their own pressing matters and problems. And only Vanessa didn't understand how she should go on living. Everything inside hurt as if her soul was crucified, stabbed with a knife and crushed into small shreds. So much so that she couldn't breathe in, couldn't breathe out. Vanessa gulped air in small gulps at the tops of her lungs. And so before her eyes all paid out with wrong steps. She was proving on a bench on the boulevard sat right on the wetboard. Squirmed, shrank, as if she wanted to become invisible, defeated lips. She whispered. She remembered something about Nick's shout in her back. But what occupied her most was the picture of the bright pink shoes she had admired so much at the sanitarium. How was that possible? Vanessa clenched her fists, so that her nails sang into her skin. Her mind cleared a little. A curious sparrow was hopping right under her feet, squinting with a lively eye, begging for crumbs. Vanessa idly followed it with her eyes. She felt neither cold nor rain. A fine shiver shook her whole body, but Vanessa didn't move. She did not understand what she should do now, where to go, and how to live. Daughter heard suddenly she was next to her. Daughter so very nice, all cold. How can you sit in a puddle? Opposite stood a little old woman dressed all in black, as if in mourning. What happened to you? She leaned toward Vanessa's face. Vanessa winced at her, looked, blinked once another, and suddenly burst into tears. The old woman recoiled fearfully, waving her arms as if that might help. Vanessa jumped up and, clasping her hands over her mouth, ran to the one place where she could now find sympathy and silent help. She ran to Nina's house. Well, that's a dog, nailed it Nina, slamming the chubby hand on the table. Not worrying angrily, she found Vanessa. For what? That's it. Nina apparently wanted to curse, but looked around and noticed the curious eyes of the children. William shouted at her so that Vanessa jumped up on the stool. Why are you still here? Shouldn't you have been out long ago? What's so hard about setting this up without me? The stubby William appeared with a frightened face, carefully pulled the children into the hallway and began fussily dressing them. It was necessary to take the daughter to the daycare center and to follow her to school. As a rule, Nina was in charge of that. But she didn't care about that today. Half an hour ago, when she'd opened the front door, she hadn't even immediately recognized Vanessa. In front of her stood a shaking woman with wet ears, hair, and defeated lips. She was frantically clinging to the jamb as if she was threatening to faint. Vanessa gasped, "Nena, Vanessa, what's wrong? Tell me what's wrong with Nick." But Vanessa only shook her head and sobbed languidly into the hallway. William and the kids. But Nina whispered at them so much that they disappeared into the room in a flash. Nina picked Vanessa up, put her arm around her shoulders and dragged her inside, sat her in a chair, fanned her, pulled off her wet coat, then led her into the bathroom. There Vanessa's sections put her under a hot shower, didn't ask anything more yet. Saw, hardly a friend in a position to say anything. William poured some strong tea. She shouted toward the kitchen and more sugar. Vanessa shuddered, tangled in a soft, warm robe that was 2 sizes larger than hers and a large one with large red poppies. The crumbs were flavored tea. Nina glanced gloomily at her friend and reached into the cupboards, pulled out a small dark bottle, poured in a tablespoon of brown liquid, stirred it into the tea. Drink it. Otherwise, saving you from pneumonia later. Vanessa obediently took a sip and coughed. The scent of whiskey reminded her of that evening in the sanatorium. When she beat Lucy's soul, tears from humiliation and resentment splashed from her eyes and her face became hot. Nina immediately wrapped her arms around her shoulders and pressed against her in pity. Her heart stabbed out of her. Would kill this Kolka would have to kill him with one blow like a green fly on the glass. When Vanessa calmed down a little and was able to tell who exactly was in bed with her husband, Nina's eyes rounded in amazement. Black lightning bolts flew across the kitchen. Too bad I'm far away. She shook her rotten fist. I give her the creep, and that'd be it. The walls would have held. That's gotta be a snake under a cold one. How did she manage it? It's been a long time, Nina. They've been together a long time, Vanessa exhaled, looking in front of her and with exhausted eyes. Nina frowned, and Vanessa began to tell her how she had started to notice lately. That Nick's mood changes like the weather in the spring, then frowns. And then suddenly he would arrive happy and even bring a small gift, a scarf or a simple bead. And a month ago, out of the blue, he gave me a wristwatch. Small and very beautiful. Vanessa admired it. It looked so nice on her hand. Always indifferent to clothes, he suddenly bought 2 new shirts, then a swamp-colored raincoat and a brown hat. He got off work a couple of times and came home late. He said the car broke down and had to be repaired. And when she embarrassingly pressed, there is to him at night sighing and pushing away. Oh, I'm tired, let's go to bed. Lucy told me in the sanatorium that her love has been friends for 6 months, continued Vanessa. Oh, I wish I knew who that friend was. It's disgusting. I can't stand it. Vanessa covered her face with her hands and sobbed. Nina drummed her fingers grimly on the table. Lucy Rat, you're meddling in someone else's family. And how on earth do they go on with Lucy? Anyway, that's how Vanessa will stay. Today I realized I have to go to work, and then I'm going home tonight. And you, Nina, take Vanessa's hand and pull her behind you. You're going to lie down now. She pointed to the couch, and you're going to try to sleep. I won't fall asleep, Nina, Vanessa said pathetically. Then lie down, Roman, and read the paper. And don't leave the house, or I know you'll go back to your Nick, she grumbled unhappily. Vanessa sat on the couch like a big and fluttering. The doll was full of cotton candy, and her knees glistened in the light of the bulb. Nina's apartment was on the 1st floor. That was why it was dusk even in the summer. Vanessa wondered how Nina did not wither. She herself was very happy to have her and Nick's rooms full of light. Remembering her husband, Vanessa sings. It felt like a knife had been twisted and stuck in her back. I'll rush in early, Nina assured her. We'll think about what to do. What's there to think about? Nina waved helplessly and walked out. Vanessa looked at her fearfully to see what she meant. Divorce. But what about it? For so many years, Vanessa shuddered and wrinkled her nose. Even though she'd been standing, she'd been in the shower for a long time, but it still felt like a barrel of mud had been poured on her. There was no way she could wash herself off. Her memory obligingly brought up again and again the picture of Nick and Lucy lying side by side in her bed. Vanessa stiffened and ducked back into her pillow, turning her head away. She stared at one point for a long time, remembering how she and Nick had gotten married, how they had lived all these years, wondering where and when she had made the mistake of pushing her husband into the wrong hands. She remembered Lucy's smooth and lustrous body, her slim waist, her long, slender legs, her way of throwing her head back, showing off her delicate neck, her thickly painted, long eyelashes. She understood why Nick had chased after youth and beauty. And suddenly Vanessa pounded herself with her battered fists at her own fault. How many times Nick told you to lose weight? That he didn't like her vulgarity, and she what? She got it. What are you complaining about now? Vanessa pulled a fat finger on herself, tangled herself up tighter. She was cold. Unnoticeably, she pulled herself up and fell asleep. And she had a terrible and strange dream, as if she was walking barefoot on a snow-covered field, falling into snowdrifts, getting out and looking ahead, and there was only white boundless desert to the horizon. Suddenly, there is a cracking sound under her feet. Vanessa looks down and sees spider webs and cracks scattering from under her feet. She is no longer in a field, but on a river. One of the cracks is getting wider and wider. There is already a large billow in front of Vera. I blackwater another second, and she falls into the depths. Gasping, she tries to get out, but is pulled under the ice. Vanessa pokes her face, and the transparent surface sees the faded sun, seeking air. But the thick crust is hard beyond breaking. And then Vanessa begins to scream, screaming with terror and pain, with despair and hopelessness. And the sun keeps shining and shining. She woke up from her own scream, not realizing the collapse with her eyes the room where she remembered that Nina had. Remembered, and how here was the heart, pressed again, harsh, like a clean paw of Van's Zello shark claws. She began to squeeze the blood out drop by drop. Vanessa lay there, not moving, patient, getting used to it. At 5 o'clock, Nina came worriedly, looked at her friend, noticed the blue shadows under her eyes and the faded, unhappy eyes. What to do with her? Quickly heated soup almost forced Vanessa to eat a few spoonfuls. The borscht was fiery with white islands of sour cream, herbs, and garlic. Vanessa had always liked the way Nina cooked, but today the food was tasteless, and the salty lump in her throat made it hard to swallow her cheek under her hand. Nina sat next to her in pity for her friend. Her soul was torn, what to help, what to do. She herself would have a short conversation with the candle. First with a frying pan in the forehead, and then to the stairwell, and followed by a suitcase with underpants and socks. But Vanessa can't do that. Nick is a light in the window for her. The doorbell rang delicately. Nina raised her eyebrows in surprise and walked out of the kitchen, opening the lock. Blushing with anger, she rested her arms at her sides. Standing in front of her was Nick. "Vanessa, you have a scowl," he asked, and immediately averted his eyes to Tibet. "What's with the challenge?" Nina asked and moved menacingly. Nick looked at her powerful figure with respect, wrinkled his nose. He had never liked this Nina. Big as a grenadier. Noisy. You give her a word and she gives you 10. Where do they come from? How does that skinny William live with her? She could crush him in his bed. I was afraid that Vanessa was kinder that way too. So I reminded her gently to watch herself. "I need to talk to her," Nick said, and stepped forward. Nina folded her arms across her chest and didn't move. Nick realized that he would not be allowed into the apartment and retreated. So he stood independently, with his chin up, that he should be embarrassed. And anyway, it's their family business. They'll deal with it without outsiders. "Get out of here." He hissed at Nina and pushed at Nick, slamming the door in his face. She listened quietly. And then a bird flew into the hallway from the kitchen. Vanessa was thrashing around. Grabbed her coat from her shoes. "Who's Nick?" "Nick? He was here." Nina looked at Vanessa darkly. Didn't stop or say anything. Vanessa ran to the bathroom, changed quickly, rushed to the door. "Let Nina in, let her in." She pleaded, not judging. "Please, I can't." I did, and ran out of the apartment without even covering the door. Nina sighed and sat down tiredly on a stool. "Oh, what a fool. What can you do to her? If she burns herself, she'll burn to ashes. So you can't even collect the ashes. That's how she is, her Vanessa. Kind, vulnerable. She doesn't know how to stand up for herself." Nina realized that her friend wouldn't listen to her and sighed. "The only thing left to do is to pity her and help her as much as you can." Vanessa ran out into the yard and immediately ran into Nick. He was standing by a wet bench, raking wet, old rags with the toe of his shoe. Leaves, seeing Vanessa, rolled his shoulder. "Let's go home and talk there," and shaved ungainly toward home. Vanessa listened to herself, what she wanted, and realized that she wanted only one thing, that Nick repented, said that everything with Lucy is over, and then they will start all over again. And maybe they'll have a baby after all. Ready to forgive him, just to end this obsession and get things back to normal. The apartment had been cleaned. If Vanessa hadn't seen Lucy with her own eyes, she would never have thought that there was a stranger at home. She was afraid to go into the bedroom. She could smell their perfume all over her. Nick sat down in the room by the table. Vanessa squatted on the couch, looking pitifully at her husband. Waited to see what he would say. Nick rubbed his forehead with his hand side, looked out the window. "Vanessa is, I don't know how it happened. I was at the sanitarium with her," Vanessa whispered, locking her fingers together. Nick wrinkled his nose. He knows. Lucy had told him everything. Coincidences like that happen. He couldn't believe his ears when he heard, and she was shocked when she saw his lawfully wedded wife. So he hid, and it still came out. I wonder how stupid Vanessa didn't figure it out back at the sanitarium. Lucy's telling the truth. She didn't give her name. She didn't say much. Nick glanced at Vanessa, met her gaze, and immediately gave up. "How long have you been with her?" Vanessa asked suddenly. Nick C. curved his lips. Why would she do that? In the spring, they took them to a museum for an exhibition. Nick wasn't interested. He kept looking at his watch. When would it be over? And then this girl walked into the hall. All right, and she's paying for it. She's sitting on a doll's legs with pointy knees. Where are her thighs curling? And when she looked at her blue eyes, she was pained. So my heart was pounding, jumping, as if it was suspended on rubber bands. They all spun quickly. He didn't want to cheat on Vanessa, but that's how it turned out. All the doctors about the child is talking about it, and is Nick, and stopped noticing, as if he was an empty place or intended only for reproduction. But he saw the wrinkles, and hit not in the neck waist and still round, like the moon. Nick how many times asked to lose weight, so she is on candy. He'll love sweets and that's it. That, and did not go out of Lucy's head with its exact forms, waist like a wasp take. It's like a fracture. And those knees were killing him. They loomed before his eyes. Sometimes he was driving along the route, and his head turned towards the museum like a sunflower to the sun. Meet her as she puts her knees out from under the skirt is not long, so all gone. Yes, and Hot Baba Lucy is not that Vanessa, like Rubino one Lucy annoyed. Money loves money, all whining, describing what she saw in the store, and how she wants to dress up. I had to tear it out of the family budget. I was gonna get a new receiver for the car, but where's Lucy going? One thing or another. And my conscience started to bother me. I had to buy gifts for Vanessa so that Vanessa wouldn't suspect anything and buy her little things. And sometimes I thought of breaking up with Lucy. Why the passion? But as soon as he sees her so hands are burning fire, how he wants to hug, kiss, hop, hot and lips. I guess it's okay. By New Year's Eve, they'll definitely be separated. And then this happened. Maybe it's for the best. Lucy asked me before she left, "What are we going to do now, Nick?" He didn't answer her. He turned away. Do what? He was happy at home. Wife cozy, and on the side passions boiling with faith. Habitual stability. And with Lucy hot embraces, kisses, and the feeling that young and capable of much more. He needs both. That's why he didn't answer Lucy's questions. Whether he would get a divorce, then began to stall for time. Talked her into waiting. I thought he'd get bored, but it doesn't get boring. Sometimes I thought after a meeting it was the last time. But 3 or 4 days passed and again, I started to see sharp knees and under the left lips. Vanessa moved quietly. Nick looked back at her, but for a moment he felt sorry for her so many years around. Not nagging, not eating away like some wives. Yeah, and compared to Nina, it's not fat. Maybe it's true. It's all about the kid. If I had a son, things would be different. Nick sighed as he hovered over my head. Those broads are nothing but trouble. He looked at Vanessa again. Sighing heavily, he stood up, moved to the couch closer to her. Vanessa flinched, threw her back out as if she was about to be whipped. Tears trembled in her eyes with the lash. Nick refused and, slowly picking up the words, spoke to Vanessa. You, if you can, forgive me. I don't know what came over me. He grinned, realized how silly it sounded that he was a young boy who didn't know what he was doing. Or did Lucy drag him in by rope? No, he did it on his own. And Vanessa needs to calm down. Otherwise, Nina is the one who told her to get a divorce. For some reason, he remembered the cutlets that Vanessa was sorry for, and always gradual, adjusted things, and not a word against. Well, Lucy, she's also a dragonfly, not suited to housekeeping. My bad to you, Vanessa. My bad. You probably won't want to look at me now. I'm confused. You know, it's just that I've been so busy at work, it's been overwhelming. You're always counting the days. You're running around to doctors, and it's like you don't even need me. I wanted a baby, Nick, our baby. Vanessa whispered. Nick shined his head and shook his lips. He was ashamed, but not for cheating, but for having to apologize. Never had he ever done that before, but it's necessary to reassure Vanessa. I understand, Vanessa said deeply. I want a child too, after all, to go fishing with him." He was silent for a while, and then he suddenly chopped. "And remember, you said I need to see a doctor too. So here I am." "Well, tell me where I'm going. And with Lucy, that's all. I promise you. That's it. You just forgive me, okay?" Vanessa turned her head incredulously. Could Nick be remorseful? She thought he would pack up and leave. To that impossibly beautiful Lucy. He's apologizing, and he's ready to see a doctor. And if it doesn't work out, Nick and I split up, sensing that Vanessa trembled. "We'll go to a baby home. We'll raise them. The main thing for a child is the example of parents, and you and I are good." We quietly asked Vanessa, "Are there any more of us?" "Of course there is, Vanessa. Otherwise, would I have run to find you in the rain to my country? I've been thinking all day, I'm driving, and you're in my mind." "What about it?" "It's all with her." Nick chopped in the air with his palm. "I told her about it today. I don't need anyone but you, Vanessa. I love you." Vanessa blinked and tears flooded her soul, relief and joy. It was so rare that Nick spoke to her of his love that she no longer hoped to hear it. She listened to herself and still felt sick to her stomach. She couldn't erase the horrible picture of Lucy and her husband. But it's so scary to be without Nick. She loves him. Nick gently put his arm around her shoulders. Vanessa didn't pull away, but froze, as if shrinking into a lump. "Don't be so hasty," Vanessa asked Nick. "And Lucy really needs to be finished," he thought, feeling his wife's warm side next to him. "You don't look for good from good. I've had my fun, and that's enough." Vanessa stood up, went to the table, leaned on it with both hands. What to do? How to make a decision here? Her mother always said, "The morning is wiser than the evening." But will tomorrow be easier and clearer? Of course, the morning didn't change anything. Vanessa lay apart from Nick on the couch. There was no way she could go near their bed. All she had to do. Lucy, with her sharp shoulders exposed, couldn't sleep for a long time. It was always like this when she was nervous. It was bittersweet that she was so raring to go home in such a hurry. She was so sure that everything would work out for them now. And then she came across the sharp prick of betrayal. It went into her soul like butter, and it left a huge hole. It was like pulling trust into space. I've only read about it in books before, but it's in the back. And now she received a blow from the closest and most beloved person, as she thought. Sad thoughts swirled in her head, and she lay there for a long time, not understanding how she should prepare Nick breakfast, pour it into tea, and pretend that nothing had happened. Now we would go to the movies, and then we would go to the cafe for ice cream. And tomorrow we could dress warmer and go to the park. And the day after tomorrow we would not get rid of this nasty wood. Sad, thought Vanessa in her warm shawl. Nick wasn't going anywhere. On the contrary, he kept peeking into the room in the evening. "Do you want me to get some cake? They should have fresh tea today. We'll have some." Vanessa shook her head. Nick disappeared, but half an hour later he was at the door again. "I've fried some potatoes, opened some tomatoes. Let's go and eat." Once again, Vanessa couldn't bring herself to move. The next evening the doorbell rang. Vanessa flinched, stricken, looked into the hallway. Was it Lucy again? Hearing the voice, Nina ran out to her. Yes, more beautiful in the coffin. Nina said gloomily, looking at her friend. Nick she did not seem to notice at all. He stood nearby and jealously watched the trouble only behind the black eyes. Now she's going to talk, but Vanessa advises, always meddling as if she had nothing to do. "Get dressed," commanded Nina. "Vanessa, let's go for a walk, because Green all that and ate." Vanessa shook her head. "I see. Come on, why are you standing there? Get dressed," I said. "It's warm there. No rain, no wind for half a year." Nick intervened in the conversation. "And what are you ordering?" Nina didn't even raise an eyebrow. She was only looking at Vanessa, and she's really going to get some air. I can't be in the same apartment with him, Vanessa thought. 10 minutes later, the friends went outside. "But how are you, Vanessa?" Nina asked. Her voice was carrying with a note of warmth, and Vanessa's nose instantly felt defensive. She was standing in a black coat and looked like a big bird with its wings down. "I don't know," Nin answered Vanessa honestly. "Nick said yesterday that he was breaking up with her, promised to go to the doctor, and even talked about the baby house. Oh, as Nina snickered. She starred beside her on her short, plump legs, but she did it so gracefully and even cheerfully that no one. And men were turning around and seeing her off with their eyes. I see, all with him. So what? Vanessa shrugged her shoulders. She was ashamed in front of her friend that she hadn't kicked Nick out, hadn't made him a scandal and made him lay at her feet, didn't run to the factory to complain and have him prescribed at a comrades' meeting, or ashamed. Oh, so ashamed. All right, Vanessa, keep your head up. We'll see what his promise is. In the meantime, let's go to the pies. Nina slipped her plump hand under the elbow of the door, and they strolled toward the pie shop, the aroma from which floated all over the street. When she returned home, Nick wasn't there. Her heart immediately snapped. Lucy sang out, "He's going to do it again." Running 2 houses now. Fell into the pillow with her face, wrapped her arms around her head. How it hurts now treason to stand between them and laugh. Wearing pink shoes. How to live with it. How do I get over it? The door banged. Vanessa listened. Nick Poe was fumbling in the hallway, peering into the room. In his hand, he held 3 sprigs of white chrysanthemums. Vanessa loved them. Be patient, Igor. There was the smell. It was associated with those rare moments when her husband showed her attention. That's why the scent was so precious. Nick looked guilty, and Vanessa noticed with pity how he'd been these days. He was still worried. Her soul stirred. She stood powerless, hands down, waiting to see what Nick would say. She could hear the ticking of a dog barking on the wall outside the window. Vanessa was afraid to meet her husband's gaze. Didn't want him to see her pain. Let him think she didn't care. Nick stomped a little at the entrance of the transparent cellophane in which the chrysanthemums were wrapped and fell asleep. Vanessa. Finally, he said, "You forgive me, Wind." Red spots appeared on his cheeks. His hands nodded and stared. He looked guilty. He held out the flowers to her, but Vanessa didn't take them. Nick sighed and lowered his hand. The chrysanthemums hung dejectedly upside down. Just like that, my happiness wrecked, thought Vanessa, and silently stepped back to the window. Nick sank down sadly on the sofa. From the very beginning, he realized that this whole idea with flowers was stupid. He found something to justify himself in front of his wife, but he couldn't think of anything else. How else could he show Vanessa that he didn't want to part with her? How could he make it up to her? It wasn't nice, of course. And what got into him when he dragged Lucy to his house? I don't know. But she's so small, so seductive. Even now, Lucy appeared before him with her immaculate knees and slim waist. Vanessa, think about it. I made a mistake, so now to execute me is life. Vanessa raised her head. Life, but I don't have a life. And cried. Not nice. Curling her lips, smearing tears down her cheeks. Nick wrinkled his nose like he'd been hurt and stared at the clutch of his hand. No, not going to make the conversation today. The meaningless and long days of fall fell, and the first snow fell. Vanessa woke up, made breakfast, silently left for work, came back and had dinner and went to bed. She slept separately from Nick, never able to return to the marital bed. Nick tried several more times to talk to Vanessa as well. It even seemed as if she had forgiven him. But as soon as he tried to touch her or kiss her, frozen listlessly like an ice statue, she was frozen. He felt it and got even angrier. What kind of woman is that, but she herself pushes him away? So far he hadn't looked any further. And she did not seek meetings with him. When visitors came into the museum, Lucy was wary of Vanessa. She didn't want to have a scandal in public. And it wouldn't do any good if she went to the boss. I knew in my heart of hearts Vanessa wouldn't go anywhere. Too proud and humble. But it was still unsettling. And my heart yearned for Nick. A man's man. No trace of intellectualism, and yet I was drawn to him. Was I really in love? After a month, I got nervous. Nick never showed up once. Is he really more interested in this amoeba? I looked at myself in the mirror. How could I trade her in for a uniform? Vanessa's eyes don't even light up. All she talks about is babies. If she laughs, she speaks softly. Not a woman, but a stale, dry man. And there was also something wrong with her health. Lucy T is not small, but still unexpected. Was it the last night spent with Nick in his apartment? Scared, nervous. She doesn't need all this trouble. And she felt sorry for her figure. She's going to run to the doctor to make sure and take action before it's too late, but she thought about it. Nick has a nice 2-room apartment. Even if he trades it in, he could get a bigger place. Is a room enough for Vanessa? She can't afford a kitten or a baby. Or maybe she'll leave to avoid seeing her ex-husband's happiness. Here she is. Lucy in her place would definitely leave twirling in front of the mirror, looking at the flat belly. Lucy suddenly froze. What if Nick would not be happy? Suddenly he would send her away and would not believe that his child looked at herself with frightened round eyes and bit her lip capriciously from the axe. Was not. You can't drag it out. We must talk to Nick at once. Lucy was born under her. She went to the factory. Walking by the gatehouse, she tangled herself in a warm scarf and pondered. It turns out the baby will be born at the end of summer. She would have to marry Nick by then. The child could be given to a nursery at 7 months, and after a year sent to her mother in the village. She had nothing to do anyway. And the grandson or granddaughter will grow up in the fresh air and eat natural food. And he and Nick will live. They will go to the sea, ride on a boat, drink cocktails, go to museums, or just sunbathe. And then they will live together, and they don't need anyone else. Lucy was so dreamy that she almost missed Nick. He came out fashion forward, and you can't tell he's almost 10 years older. The hat is to his face. Coat fits like a mannequin and not from the store. Good thing he didn't shave his belly like other men. There's an unusual warmth in my chest, but she's partial. She's partial to Nick. Nick called softly. Nick turned around. He changed his face and stealthily, looking around, walked towards her. He grabbed her elbow painfully and dragged her behind the newsstand. Why did you come here? He hissed. Not enough for Vanessa to see him now? Or any of her merchandise? It would be a big talking point. Then she would never forgive him. Sleeping apart as if they were divorced. I was angry. What a stubborn woman. Maybe he's really wasting his time with her, but something stopped him from divorcing her. It's a shame about the apartment. And most of all, the thought of losing her. Look for comfort and convenience, and then get a new one. You get used to her cutlets borscht, or even would be he would have to live and eat in the canteen. You'll have to learn how to set the arrows on your pants. Nick, what are you doing? Outraged, Lucy tried to pull my arm out. Where the hell are you? You don't show up, and I keep waiting. She smiled and fluttered her eyelashes at the marshal. Knowing how well that works on men, Nick grunted, blushed, and turned away. Lucy stood in a short coat with a fluffy collar and sparkled. Impossibly beautiful legs. The dainty-heeled boots made them look infinitely long. Let's go. Nick muttered and strode down the street. Lucy took off after him. They reached the nearest coffee shop and happily hid from the cold wind inside. Nick bought 2 glasses of tea, and Lucy asked for more shortbread. She was terribly hungry from Gustav's small piece. Lucy licked her lips and held her gaze on Nick. He intervened and began to move a straw forgotten by someone on the table. Nick, stop humoring. Decisively, suddenly said Lucy. What have you decided? Or did you just quietly run away? You didn't even bother to tell me. Nick grimaced, hurriedly took a sip of tea and choked. He coughed, and Lucy immediately scooted closer and patted him on the back thoughtfully. Nick nodded and, taking out a handkerchief, waved his forehead. Lucy remained standing next to him, nuzzling with her whole body. Nick felt dizzy with sweetness, and the smell of perfume reminded him of the moments of their passion. Lucy, with difficulty, he said, It's complicated, you see. Everything that's complicated. Flapped her eyelashes. Lucy, you what? You fell out of love with me and decided to give up on me. She sobbed, and her eyes instantly filled with tears that glistened crisply, reflecting the glare of the dim light bulb. Nick, annoyed, Leva whirled his head around. How tired he was of these womanizing tears. Then Vanessa whining, then this. He tried not to think about the fact that he himself had made this mess. Nick whispered pitifully, Lucy, you can't leave me, I'm having a baby. Nick stared at her face in amazement. Lucy was staring with round, childlike eyes, trusting and frightened. The look had long ago been rehearsed in front of the mirror. Nick looked around, looked at Lucy again, and suddenly smiled. "That's right, I'm not lying." Lucy pressed her lips together resentfully and exclaimed again, "You don't want to believe me, don't believe me." Nick laughed and put his arm around her waist. Then he looked her over from head to toe, lingered on her belly, not realizing that his child, his son, might be there. When Vanessa spent all day teaching about babies, it annoyed him. And now, learning that Lucy was pregnant, he felt such joy that he was even scared. Does he really care that much? "So Nick, what are we gonna do?" "Do what?" "Live. The son will be born with James in his name." James sounds depressed. Lucy confirmed, feigning concern. "But what about you and me? What about us?" Nick grimaced. "What about what? You have to have a legitimate child." Nick looked at Lucy puzzled. He hadn't thought that he would have to organize this moment. Lowering his head, he began to examine his fingers through the cracks. The leather was clogged with grime from machine oil. Lucy regarded his silence in her own way, that to Vanessa yours would return. She'll never give birth to that hollow flower of yours. And here Nick is already your son. She patted her stomach. "But since you don't need him, then be quiet." Nick whispered, looking around. "Why are you yelling? What am I supposed to do?" Lucy snapped, carefully wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. "I can't get him out alone. You're the one who got embarrassed." "Nick, why alone? I'll help you. I'm not leaving." Lucy's eyes instantly went dry and round. "Oh, you won't quit, you'll help." But she hissed her thanks like a cat, and then also bowed to the floor, waving his hand. So it was almost a mistake to put the glasses on the floor. Nick rushed to her to calm her down. "What's the matter with you?" "I've been living, and now it's an icy desert at home. And now it's like a circus." "You got it all wrong." "Is that it, Nick? Either you get a divorce and marry me so the baby's legal or there's no baby. I don't want to be a single mom. Think it over." Lucy turned around and proudly stuck her chin up and headed for the exit. Nick remained standing at the table. He couldn't run after her like a boy, for God's sake. All night he'd been wondering what to do now. He didn't like the fact that Lucy was blackmailing him. And on the other hand, the child might not be mine after all. I wondered if I needed those diapers. Night cries, cast iron head in the morning. And why didn't I live peacefully? I spent half the night thinking about how I could arrange everything so that I wouldn't have to change anything in my life. He never came up with anything. Vanessa noticed that something was eating her husband, but she had almost no strength to think about him. I wish I could figure it out for myself. I have to decide whether to try to start over or to file for divorce. It's embarrassing. And it'll be known at work in no time. She won't be able to get fired. She sees Nick at the factory every day. Walk away from him, Nana advised. You could get sick from worrying about him. So where am I going? Vanessa asked dejectedly. Nina slapped a small hand on her round knee. I have what? My auntie has a spare room. She was just complaining that it was getting a little hard for her to clean. And it's hard to go to the store. She broke her leg in the winter. So now she's afraid to take a step out of her way. I run to her once a week. I bring her half-finished products. I wipe the floors. So Nina, you run around and you'll have your own corner. You'll be your own boss. And no Kolia around. Oh, Nina, thank you. But no, I don't want to embarrass your aunt. We won't be surprised. Really? Nina waved his hands. Aunt Kate, what kind of person is she? She's been a librarian all her life. An intelligent woman who reads books in French. She'll have more fun. She said so herself. It would be good to find a companion like in the 19th century. It's harder to live alone. You'll be bored while she's here. She'll be glad to have you. And then you'll share the apartment with Nikki. You'll have your own place. Oh, you're scared, Vanessa. And even pale. I'm not going to share the apartment. Nick was getting it with an extra payment. Yeah, Nina nodded, looking at her manicure. Nick did. Where did he get the extra money from? And from your inheritance. I found it too. She's proud. It's your money, Vanessa. It's yours. And you have every right to the apartment. So forget your awkwardness and start thinking about yourself. Understood, Vanessa nodded. I wish I could just close the subject already. I found the home I once loved, where I made it cozy and dreamed of the future. There's nothing there now, just ruins and your chrysanthemums in a vase. I lived another week with Nick, and I kept looking at him and thinking about him. Maybe she could forgive him. Remembered the good times, talked myself into trying. Maybe the baby would come. I almost did. Threw out of her head all Nana on Tip's combination, bought a new one, surrounded the young. Decided to be wiser and keep the family. Lucy can be many, but the wife is still one. Shoved deep all the doubts and resentments at the thick layer of indifference, and rushed to build on the ashes. Today, Vanessa resolutely said to herself, leaving work, now I'll come home, I'll cook dinner, I'll pour tincture Nick. Let's try to forget everything. On the way, I remembered that I had to buy bread. I figured out where the nearest store was and walked there, writhing against the rain and snow. What was flying right in her face? Bought bread. Thinking about the upcoming evening, crossed the road, turned to the bakery, trying not to look in the direction of the museum, where sneaky Lucy worked, and suddenly froze right in front of her at the fountain, which was no longer working. She saw her husband. Lucy was standing next to him, holding a bouquet of white chrysanthemums, the same ones Nick had recently used to beg for forgiveness. And we hurried past passersby hurrying into the warmth. They were hitting Vanessa, shoving her shoulder, but she wouldn't budge, with a defeated look on her face. Watching Nick take Lucy's palm in his hand, bring it to his lips and kiss it, she laughed. She flashed her long horse teeth and shook out her curls. Here Nick reached up and whispered something in her ear, and Lucy shook her head coquettishly and took him under her arm, hiding under the umbrella. They walked down the street. Again, someone rudely pushed Vanessa and even swore at her. She seemed to wake up with a blink and tears that immediately mixed with the rain and walked towards the house. She walked faster and faster, almost ran, and passersby looked in amazement at the full and pretty woman with eyes that were not alive. At home, Vanessa took out the suitcase she had taken with her to that unfortunate sanatorium and started throwing the most necessary things. She was in a hurry. She was afraid that Nick would come back, and then she wouldn't be able to leave. She would start listening to his excuses again. And the lies. No, she could never live with a man who lies all the time. It's torture. Even a harmless delay from work will cause panic and suspicion. He'll never break up with this Lucy. He'll never break up with her. She's too young and beautiful. Vanessa picked up her suitcase, hung her purse on her shoulder, and looked around the apartment. How much effort had been put into it? Her nest. But here came a fatal beauty and ruined everything. The apartment was resentfully silent. It didn't want to be without a landlady. It was too accustomed to cleanliness and order. The front door slammed, came back in the lock. The key dragged. Rustled a piece of paper on the table, were in hurried handwriting. Vanessa informed Nick that she was filing for divorce herself. What's on your mind? Nick growled at Vanessa at the front door. Why are you embarrassing me? I'm crawling on my knees before you to atone for my sins. And here's how. Vanessa calmly released her elbow from her husband, looked at him from head to toe, and silently went on. Stop, shouted Nick, so loudly that the janitor looked out from behind the glass booth. Nick hurried after him. Vanessa turned down a neighboring street, but Nick kept up with the janitor. Don't be stupid. Don't play with fire. I can do it too. What? What can you do? Vanessa turned to him. You already can, she added bitterly. Don't embarrass yourself, Nick. You're sitting on 2 chairs, and don't bother me anymore, or everyone will know about your adventures. You can't be ashamed of yourself. Nick hissed angrily. Vanessa looked surprised. There's no more shame, Nick. There's nowhere else. You can live with your crawl, and you're welcome to it. Now that you're in love. Nick turned white with anger. Why the hell is she telling him what to do? She gives him permission to live with whom, and she left him first. He's not the man who left the woman, but she ran away in a whiskers, banged the hammer. Here comes love. With a challenge, he said. Love and the child Lucy, and I will have as my child. I see you're empty, light. He spat under his feet. Vanessa swayed. It felt like a train had come at her, hit her with all its might, rolled her across the tracks, scattered the debris on her sides. She turned pale and bit her lip, looked at the dead man with lice eyes, afraid to take a breath to keep from squirming in pain, turned away and hurried down the street, not seeing the road. Nick looked after her, crinkled his nose, and went to Lucy. He would tell her that he had kicked his wife out of the house and would soon divorce her. Let her look at him with admiration and rejoice in her position. It was good for her. He was glad he wouldn't have to decide anything himself. It was good that Vanessa had left on her own. Except that no one needs to know about it. Let everyone think that it was he who left her, that over there in their garage Valerka also screwed with one left his wife and sons, and now lives with young people. And so, that the matter is mundane. Lucy asked in amazement, clasping her hands to her chest, that he had kicked her out. Well, not exactly kicked out. Nick averted his eyes. I told him we were in love, that you were expecting a baby, said that I'm thinking of getting a divorce, and we can't live together. Where did she go? Lucy asked. In her heart, she felt sorry for Vanessa. She's naive and stupid. She's always unlucky. I don't know, shrugged Nick. He was still angry, nothing to point out. But he was actually more angry with himself. He hated to remember the cruel words he'd said. Vanessa had hit a sore spot. He felt like a scoundrel now, having beaten up the weak. That's why he tried to chase these thoughts away and make himself more angry. So move in with me, he said firmly. You don't want to live in your little cubbyhole. Lucy did live in a small room in a communal apartment. One neighbor drank mercilessly, dragged from the street all sorts of junk, making them not only his room, but also the corridor and the common kitchen. In another room lived a deaf pensioner who always lost her hearing aid and therefore yelled at the whole apartment, cursing the one who stole her device. And in the third room lived the storekeeper, with whom Lucy had a permanent conflict. They hated each other fiercely, and so frankly that they could barely keep from beating each other. The storekeeper took men to her in the hope of getting married and leaving this hell. But the men always squinted their eyes in Lucy's direction. Why did Valtha hate her? Lucy wouldn't even leave food on the stove. She was afraid the neighbor would put something on the stove. She couldn't wait to get out of the tiny dark room, and all the swearing and noise. And just when things were looking blackest, Nick came and called her in. It was a miracle. The other thing is, she's not going to have a baby. It was a false alarm. But Nick doesn't need to know about it. Lazy and smart, what woman is given right? To sneak around where you can't take the direct route. Vanessa's staying with Aunt Kate. She didn't tell me anything. Not about what Nina saw of Nick with Lucy. Not about his ruthless words, just that she decided to leave. She couldn't live with him anyway. She didn't want to relive the whole nightmare of Hartik, so it was out of breath. Aunt Kate was the complete opposite of her niece. Tall, thin as a stick with a straight back and flexible long neck and gray hair. She gathered in an elegant bundle, always lined her lips, and even at home wore white blouses with lace collars. And when she went on business, pinned to the thief, a brooch in openwork frames. Every morning, Kate stood at the back of the chair and, holding onto it, performed a few ballet exercises. Despite her age, flexibly threw herself in different directions, gracefully swung her arm, and covered her eyes languidly and looked at herself in the mirror of the antique closet. Always trim, pedantic, and neat. She was an example for Vanessa, who after the collapse of family happiness could not get together, crumbled into pieces, and no matter how much she strengthened herself and tried to seem indifferent, lost interest in life. Kate immediately realized that Vanessa was like a bird with a battered wing. She felt with her skin how painful and cruel someone had offended her, and therefore she did not meddle in her soul. And in the evenings she read French novels aloud. It was warm and cozy. Above the table, a crimson lampshade with golden tassels glistened the sides of a porcelain teapot with bright dragon teeth. Lived Tell appetizing them with barrels of cookies. After tea, Vanessa moved to the sofa and, having tucked up her legs, listened for hours to the murmuring French speech, though she did not understand a word, but now and then she imagined herself in the distant villages of lavender. In their meadows and green valleys she rested her soul. Vanessa was healing. It seemed to her that she returned to her mother's cozy home, where peace and tranquility reigned. The wounded soul complained despondently, but increasingly hushed and not in a loud voice. Aunt Kate from the Vanessa factory quit her job, tired of dreading meetings with her husband. And what she disliked more were the looks, the women, the pitying looks. As they look at the Victory or Steps bottomless dog and pity and approach afraid. Suddenly Contagious moved to the archive to work at the Scientific Research Institute. The work is quiet, the team is pleasant, and most importantly, no one knows anything about her. She gave copies to scientific staff, received papers from them, embroidered the cipher, assigned, and on a cart, taken to the racks for storage. Quiet, no fuss, but time to think. The brass was pretty slow. By nature, Vanessa did not mix things up, meticulously searching for the necessary documents, and was always friendly. No one would have thought that she had cats on her soul. One day she came in and found 3 white carnations on the table in a milk bottle. I looked around in surprise, and there was no one there. "Hello, Vanessa." She turned around at the door, and this is Michael, the junior researcher, lanky, thin with a big nose and nearsighted eyes. He always took off his glasses when he came to the archive, so he was always squinting and bumping into the shelves. "I ordered a certificate yesterday," blushed, Michael informed. Vanessa smiled. "I've noticed that he's been coming here a lot. Probably flowers from him. God, where did he get the money to buy bouquets in winter?" "Yes, Michael Gennadievich, everything is ready." Vanessa smiled welcomingly and deftly took out the necessary paper from the folder. Michael reached out his hand and lightly touched Vanessa's fingers. She let the austerities go and turned away to the shelves. There was no way this young man would think she was ready to hook up with him. After all, she's about 7 years older than him. "Goodbye, Michael Gennadievich," Vanessa said goodbye dryly. She touched the inflorescences with her hand, sighed at the faint herbaceous odor. She didn't like carnations. The cemetery reminded her of her mother. And Lucy was happily packing. She was so eager to move in with Nick that she left only the essentials in her suitcase and jumped out into the hallway. "Where are you going?" Frowned at the neighbor. "Are you going to the resort again?" "No, not to the resort." With pride jerked her chin Lucy to her husband. "I do not see that bedbugs live in it." Contemptuously, she added. With undisguised pleasure looked at the blush of envy and anger, the face of the neighbor, and left the apartment, loudly slamming the door in her face. Nick immediately picked up the suitcase and loaded it into the trunk of the cab. He wanted to whisper to Lucy that Vanessa had decided everything herself. So he flaunted himself in front of the woman, pretending to be a determined man. Lucy smiled and slid her hand under his elbow, clenched tightly against Nick. He was embarrassed and snickered at the old man driver for throwing curious glances at them. Look at him. They're not young people, but they're all huddled together. All night, Lucy thought about how she could make things better. She decided to give Nick a full honeymoon, so it'll all work out. And then she'll just say the baby was born a little premature. It happens, and men don't know about this stuff, and Nick won't even look into it. Entering the apartment, Lucy grumbled unhappily. We'll have to redo everything here. It's tasteless. The lace napkins alone are worth what? What an uneducated bourgeois Vanessa was. But the first thing to do in the bedroom is to change the curtains and bedspreads. Too bad it won't work quickly with the furniture, but that's okay. In time we'll sell the dark cabinets, merchant all light, so that the apartment to play up. In the meantime, the #1 task is not to let Nick out of bed. Soon an unpleasant surprise was revealed. Nick didn't respond so ardently to her lacy shirts. Not like before, when his eyes were becoming. All it took was a shoulder to bear. Once Lucy became available any day. Nick seemed to lose interest in her. Lucy did all sorts of things, from buying wine to romantic dinners. She'd meet him naked in the bathroom. But he almost didn't react, just glanced at her indifferently, and that's it. Where did everything go? Sitting there reading the paper or watching TV, Lucy was getting nervous. Soon it will turn out that there is no pregnancy. What if Nick sends her back? What then? Go back to her communal apartment for joy. Yes, she's living her life of ridicule, invited her friend from work to her birthday party. Lucy at first did not want to go, but Maria promised an interesting fun company to divorce at least, and that as in the water lowered go, convinced Maria. And how to be fun. Nick not a peep about the divorce. He falls asleep in bed. And he made up an excuse that he doesn't want to harm the child. They've had a couple of times, of course. But Lucy's not so sure that it's all worked out, and we can't drag it out any longer. The birthday really turned out to be fun. A few guides came Methodist Pavel Petrovich, who however did not stay long. And Masha's boyfriend called two of his friends, one black as a crow with a hooked nose clearly of Oriental blood, and the other redhead, like a clown in the circus. Both wooed at cross purposes. And Lucy smiled sweetly and danced with them in turn. And again the gray mouse guides looked at her enviously. And again all the men's attention was fixed on Lucy. And what was her fault? Well, she's beautiful. That's all. The champagne was flowing and they were long gone. Only Maria and her boyfriend, Robert and Ethan, remained. Lucy was laughing, dancing. Asked for a refill on her glass again. She had some unbridled fun and forgot. Is there any other way she could come back? Home. She can't get used to it. That there waits for her they're not shabby rooms, but a decent apartment and almost a husband on the bed. Shaking in the dance, rock and roll, throwing off her long, slender legs, again demanded cold champagne, and then the lights and faces, bottles, furniture swirled. Lucy fell into a thick fog. She woke up in the morning from the cold. The window was open and a gray dawn loomed behind the curtains. Lucy groaned her head was pierced by a terrible pain. Her mouth felt dry and disgusting. How much had she drunk last night? Suddenly she pulled her eyes open in horror. She was lying sprawled on the sofa, and on either side of her two men, Robert and Ethan, were drinking. On one side, head black, and on the other redhead Lucy had pulled up the bedspread to cover her breasts. God, what was going on here? I mean, she doesn't remember a thing. Well, she danced, but she laughed. She tried to make toasts. She climbed further up on the table for some reason. What next? How did she end up here with two people at once? And what happened between them? What kind of nightmare? Lucy carefully got out on the floor and began to dress quickly. I could barely find my crumpled dress. In the chest of men's things, the underwear also had to be searched in my head. In spite of the pain, the only thought on my mind was, what about Nick? She didn't show up for the sleepover, all gone. Now he's gonna put her out on the street. My God, what an idiot. But why did she have to drink so much? He knows what a bad influence alcohol has on her. She slipped out of the room and into the kitchen. On the way, she looked in on Maria's little Spanish woman. She was asleep, tangled up in her blankets. And next to her, Vitalik advised her. Lucy gently shook Maria by the shoulder. She woke her up and called her to the kitchen with a nod of her head. While Mashka got dressed, Lucy enjoyed drinking cold water straight from the tap. Then she put her wet palms to her cheeks and a pill to her forehead. Again, she remembered Nick. She felt sick with horror. She'd ruined it for herself. Don't worry, you muttered to Maria, also writhing with a headache. You'll say you felt sick, so I had to stay. Better yet, lie about having to call an ambulance. But then it turned out that it was nothing bad. He was released only in the morning. I see, Lucy is lost. Shook her head. The picture with Robert and Ethan sleeping next to each other wouldn't go away. Mash. How did I end up with them? She asked, embarrassed. Maria laughed. That's how it turned out. They were good too. And I was with them what? Excruciatingly blushed. I barely audibly asked Lucy. Well, that's for you to know. Maria was surprised. I did not stand next to it. Vitalik and I also went to bed. Oh, and celebrated. Quickly, mine's at 6. Lucy jumped outside. She was terrified that Robert and Ethan would wake up and have to face them. No, she'd rather go home. She felt incredibly nauseous, swollen and hot tongue, expressed in her periscope mouth. Wanted to take a shower and collapse into her bunk. She quietly opened the door, quickly hung up her coat, and stepped into the bathroom. We have to get cleaned up right away. Otherwise, Nick wouldn't believe she was at Masha's. After 15 minutes, I looked at myself in the mirror, a little pale, but that's even better. There's blue under my eyes. But a walk in the fresh air helped to get rid of the compartment. Lucy brushed his teeth thoroughly, then thought he brushed and brushed again, and only then quietly went outside. Nick slept in the big room on the couch. He hadn't even undressed. Nick quietly called out to Lucy. Her eyes were sad and glistening with excitement. Nick looked up all over, saw Lucy, and rubbed his face with the palm of his hand. "Where have you been?" he asked hoarsely. His gaze was a prickly frown. Lucy let on a miserable look. "I had to stay at Masha's. She had a salad there, probably not fresh, so she could not get away from the toilet. Or maybe it was the sex." Lucy sighed weakly, wrinkled her nose. "And now I'm still nauseous. I wanted to go home. I couldn't. I knew you'd be worried." "Worried? I didn't sleep half the night. Why didn't you throw up before?" Nick was suspicious. "It doesn't start right away, Nick. It's about time. I'm gonna go to bed. I don't feel so good. I don't want to hurt the baby. Why don't you make me some sweet tea?" "Okay, sweetie." And somehow it came so naturally to her, so touching that it made Nick's heart flutter. He had no suspicions. How could a pregnant woman be suspicious? "Oh, Lucy," and desperate you pulled Maria with admiration a month later, when she learned that her friend is now definitely expecting a baby. And how? No way. Lucy cut her off. "It's Nick, the baby, period." She believed it herself. She tried to erase from her mind everything that had preceded the pregnancy. There was nothing. A dream mirage. There was only Nick, and she was a month overdue. True, only the doctor at the counseling center knows. And Nick will be happy with 8 months and a son or daughter just in time to sign while the belly is not visible. She's been lucky so far in everything. Vanessa filed for divorce herself and quietly didn't even claim the apartment. "Nina, how did you find out?" Nina shook her hands, but Vanessa only shook her head, not allowing her to burst into reproaches. "Do not want to." "Nina, I don't want to continue to wallow in this mud. If I were with my child, it would be fine. As it is, I'm fine at Aunt Kate's. What am I gonna share? It's disgusting." Nina, she just glared, but she didn't say a word. "I felt sorry for my friend. I'll get on the waiting list. I won't be homeless." Vanessa waved her off, and Lucy ran to the atelier to the dressmaker, sewed a wedding dress, pestered Maria to get white shoes for her. Nick watched in amazement as his quite decent salary disappeared. They had already gotten into his savings. He was not used to such waste. Vanessa was very frugal and not a spender. Tried to appeal to prudence, but Lucy portrayed a tear, let go. And such sadness her face appeared that Nick instantly felt on edge. The latter spat, waved his hand after the wedding will calm down. Only one condition categorically set: no guests and restaurants. The two of them will go out together. Quietly paint a cake home for tea will buy. Lucy wanted to resent, but in time realized that it is better not to anger Nick, or else everything. You could lose it that way. Well, the hell with it, she'll survive without a holiday. The main thing is everything else, as in a fairy tale. Having received the certificate of divorce, Vanessa felt strange. She felt like a fictitious person. No husband, no children, nothing. Only dusty folders in the archive with French novels dived into the basement floor every day. It was as if she was hiding from the world, staring sadly into the high ranks and windows. A little more time would pass, and she would turn into a young single woman, and then into a pensioner. She would go to warm herself at someone else's hearth. At Nina's to watch her children grow up and rejoice when grandchildren appeared. And she herself would probably get a cat in the street and feed the mustachioed ones. Sometimes she smoked herself for selling Mama's house at Nick's insistence. She'd go there now and live quietly and peacefully. How much does she need on her own? She remembered John, whom she'd met on the train. I found a piece of paper with his number, and my hand reached for the phone. I wanted to talk to someone. I felt very lonely, but I couldn't help it. Why bother a man? He has his own life, his own problems. He won't even remember the strange aunt with whom he drank tea and crunched cookies. It's Christmas. Vanessa celebrated at Nina's. It was very heartwarming. Aunt Kate came too. Vanessa helped to prepare salads, baked honey cake together, put presents under the tree. The chimes were beating, golden champagne poured into glasses, wishes were being made, and blush was shouted. Nina in a red sequin dress. Vanessa, did you make a wish? Vanessa laughed, came to her head, and what wishes could she have? The same thing for years. Made a wish every year. And what? Didn't come true, did it? And now I don't need anything. The days dragged on monotonously. One after another, sometimes the sun looked out, and it became a little more cheerful. But the rest of the time Vanessa as if she did not live, but was in the floor. Vanessa, can't you have a baby for yourself? Nina asked cautiously. Vanessa smiled sadly. From whom? Nina, I don't want to. I don't. I know what it's like to grow up without a father. It's selfish to have a baby for yourself. After New Year's, Aunt Kate was going to visit some friend of hers. Nina and Vanessa talked her into waiting until spring. But Kate stood her ground. She's ill, very ill. I'm afraid she won't live till spring. We saw her off a few days later. Nina came down with the flu of the whole family. Vanessa came running, made morsels, and went to the pharmacy. And a little later, she came down with it herself. And that's when it got scary. All alone, no one to buy medicine from the neighbors. Only old ladies, dandelions of God around. Where can they run in the frost and snow? And I'm afraid to knock on their door and they'll get infected. Her head was buzzing from the fever, her cough was like a bell, and her throat felt like a big ball of thorns stuck in it. Vanessa, staggering with weakness, warmed her tea and diluted the baking soda to gargle her throat. The prescription from the doctor was on the table, and Vanessa realized that folk remedies wouldn't help her. She needed medication. The thought of calling Nick crossed her mind, but she shuddered in disgust. She didn't need to ask him for help. And then it hit her. Probably, if she hadn't had a fever, she never would have called. It's like an obsession. She found a piece of paper in her purse, looked at the numbers, and not to change her mind. Quickly dialed the number 1 beep, 2nd, 3rd do not answer. That's fine, so there was no need to call. Vanessa was about to hang up the phone as panting. A voice answered, speaking. Hello, may I speak to John? Vanessa Brunson asked. She clarified for some reason. That's me. What's this about? Vanessa was confused. She was silent, not knowing how to explain who she was. I'm not inquiring. I'm sorry, Vanessa was about to hang up. Wait, I recognize your voice. Vanessa, exhausted, leaned against the wall, her legs knotted and big red circles floated in front of her eyes. Every now and then they burst and splintered into small trails. John, this is Vanessa. Finally, she asked, do you remember when we were on the train together? I was going to the sanatorium and you were going on a business trip, Vanessa? Oh, I'm sorry, Vanessa. I never thought I'd hear from you again. I'm so glad you called. You sound a little sick, though. There's nothing wrong with you. Concerned? I asked John. No, Vanessa suddenly exclaimed. I'm not all right. I'm very sick and no one's around. I need to get some medicine from the pharmacy. She suddenly felt very sorry for herself and wiped away the running tears with her fingers. What's the address? Resolutely answered the man. Where to come? Maybe I should buy something on the way? What kind of pills do you need? Oh, I left the doctor's prescription list here, Vanessa almost whispered. She was afraid to believe what she was hearing. Would someone drop everything and come for her? Help her? It was so amazing. She was rarely sick, but when she was, Nick never took care of her. On the contrary, he was displeased as she couldn't find the strength to cook dinner and asked him to make dumplings. The medicine was usually brought by Nina. Nick watched TV, read the newspaper, and generally thought that Vanessa was just pretending. But if he got sick, Vanessa had to spend all her free time with him. She ran around the city looking for a scientific chicken. After all, a sick man needs nutritious broth. She brought him medicine by the hour, gave him a thermometer, and applied the compressor bulb, even though the temperature was not high. If a mustard patch was needed, Nick would get cranky like a child and Vanessa would have to coax him, and even bring him candy. Nick's illness turned into worship of Nick. And for the first time, a man is willing to drop his business for her and come over. Is that how it works? Vanessa dictated the address. John promised to be there in an hour. Vanessa looked at herself in the mirror. The horror. Red trailing eyes, the skin under her nose would improve. Voice warm advice and a cough erupting as well. Every minute is good. On the other hand, it's not like she's his date. Yeah, she'll give him a little human help, bring him some medicine, and that's it. She'll never see him again. Let him be like Timur the sheep. Vanessa went back to her room and crawled under the blanket. She lay down for a while. No strength at all. She dozed off. She woke up to the doorbell. Slippers passed from the lawsuits, fell down the corridor, on the way grabbed from the kitchen a prescription for medication. We'll give it right away, so as not to make her wait long and, God forbid, will infect more. She opened the door. On the landing stood John tall, looking like Santa Claus in a fur hat. Only without the beard, he squeezed past Vanessa and walked into the hallway. He had a bag in his hand that held something weighty. "Where are your kitchens, Vanessa?" asked John and separated. Sam headed down the hallway. She was confused. Little at the gate Robe, not understanding why he entered the apartment, went into the kitchen. John had already put a jar of cranberry jam on the table, put out lemons, a few tangerines. Vitamins. He smiled, looked at Vanessa, frowned, and suddenly put his hand to her forehead. Wow, at the whistle. He pointed briskly to the bed. "Where's the prescription?" Vanessa obediently handed him a piece of paper. John scrutinized the doctor's confused handwriting and tucked the prescription into his pocket. "Lie down," he advised. "I'll be right back." Vanessa smiled weakly, blew her nose, and holding back a cough, went to her back. She could feel John's gaze on her as she fell strengthlessly into the bed. She didn't care what the man there thought of her. There was the clinking of dishes in the kitchen. The gas came on, the kettle on the stove rattled. 5 minutes later, John appeared in the room. In his hand, he held a steaming wine mug. In a stool, put the drink cranberries, crushed in boiling water and lemon-prone. "Now it will cool down a little, and be sure to drink it, Vanessa. It's very healthy. You promise?" Vanessa nodded and turned away. She didn't want John to notice her tears. She didn't have David looking presentable. She wanted to hide under the blanket with her head buried. John disappeared. The front door slammed. Vanessa reached out, picked up the mug, took a sip of the pleasant Kislev, and the liquid refreshed her mouth. Vanessa didn't notice as she drank it all down. From the throw on the pillow, it became hot. Her hair stuck to her temple. 20 minutes later, John returned. In his hand, he held a paper bag of medication. He squinted. He reread the doctor's prescription again, squeezed out a few pills, and brought warm water. He smiled approvingly when he saw the empty mug. "Have you eaten anything?" he asked worriedly. Vanessa shook her head. "I don't feel like it, do I?" "Well, your body knows it needs to conserve its strength for now, so drink plenty. I'll give you a whole jar right now. I'm not interfering. Your fever will go down, you'll feel better. You'll be able to make your own tea." It was like he was making excuses for Vanessa. It was embarrassing. A distracting man with a son at home. "John, are you eating?" Thank you. You've been very helpful." "Thank you. Thank you." "Oh, there's money in my purse." John's annoyed. Leva wrinkled his nose and waved his hand, but Vanessa didn't have the energy to argue. "Do you mind if I come back tomorrow?" Suddenly, John asked, embarrassed. Why was Vanessa startled? John shrugged his shoulders. "If you don't have an answer, I'll come by tonight." "Okay, I'll bring you something to eat. I hope you feel better tomorrow. You just take care of yourself." "Okay," he wagged his finger sternly. Vanessa smiled. Wasn't she dreaming? She was grateful to John for not questioning why she was here alone. Where was her husband's family? How come there was no one else to turn to? After taking all the medication, she felt herself leaving her body. The pain let go of her head, and it became easier to breathe. When the fever goes down, she put herself a mustard patch and immediately coughed less, and then boiled herself some milk noodles, her favorite dish from her childhood. Vanessa fell soundly asleep as if she had fallen into a pit. Meanwhile, a man sat in the half-empty streetcar shelter and smiled, feeling the confused look of the woman he had so often remembered after his trip. His son met him, grumbling, "Where have you been?" "I've already reheated the pasta twice." John ran his hand over the rags on his head. The boy dodged embarrassedly. "I went to help a good man." He sat down to dinner, looking at his son, growing, changing, becoming more and more like Helen. Serious chess, loves math, and reads a lot like Helen. It's been 5 years since she and her son have lived together. Helen left very quickly, burned out in 2 months. No one expected that so quickly a young blooming woman would weaken so much that she couldn't lift her head from her pillow. "Take care of the shop, John," whispered in her last days. A month after the funeral, a neighbor began to order, but John quickly made it clear that he had no intention of having an affair. He had a son to raise. No time for fooling around. Not at work either. To non-drinking, we are not yet old widower whipped wedges, lonely ladies, but John did not care. And here only recently fell into his heart modest eyes, and a woman with hair like a mermaid, and today miraculously met with her again. If they could make it work, though I'm afraid. Who would want to get along with a teenager, and I don't know how Liam will react. Her heart squeezed longingly from the big picture, calmly, with a smile looking at him. Helen as if encouraged and asked not to be afraid of anything. 0 o'clock rolled around, could not sleep, got up, poured himself warmth, absorbent cotton, water from the kettle, listened. Didn't wake up my son and waited. Waiting for tomorrow, or rather the evening. All day Vanessa wondered if John would come. The fever still lingered, but the weakness lessened, and Vanessa was able to reach the bathroom to wash her face, combed her hair, poured it into a tight and thick braid over her shoulder and face, and tucked it under her eyes. Shadows appeared, and the eyes themselves became even bigger. She changed her clothes a little, moved into the room, and shot up the bed. It was uncomfortable to lie unmade. Her heart raced and her hands shook from weakness. Vanessa lay down, but pulled the plaid over herself. She dozed off and dreamed she was walking along an endless sad beach, the sun beating brightly in her face. The outlines of the mountains could be seen in the distance, and the waves and bridal lace plume her bare feet. The hem of the long sundress long ago could and stuck to the screen. But Vanessa stubbornly steps forward, because there in the distance she sees a certain light silhouette. It attracts her like a magnet. She goes on and on. But the silhouette does not come closer. And then Vanessa runs and suddenly falls in the distance. A steamship rumbling still. Then again Vanessa shuddered and opened her eyes, lying a bell, cutting the silence of the apartment. Vanessa jumped up, tangled in his shoulder, and nearly fell, yanked out of herself an angry flurry, but her soul sang with joy. He had come, he had not deceived her. She stuck her feet in her slippers, went to open. Finally relieved, exhaled John. "I've been calling and calling. I was afraid. Maybe they took you to the hospital." "I fell asleep," Vanessa said, embarrassed. She drew herself up and let John in. He again held a bag with a long loaf sticking out of it. The man charged in, went into the bath, slept on his hands, and then went masterfully into the kitchen. Vanessa followed him uncomplainingly. "Are you feeling better today?" John remarked satisfactorily, and like a wizard took out of the bag a chicken. Not blue with cow-like clean legs, but small, yellow, and quite appetizing to look at. "Here's a homemade chicken," John said proudly, and looked for the pot with his eyes. Vanessa was taken aback. She looked at the man as if she saw an alien in front of her. Is it possible to be so economical? Oh yes, Vanessa remembered. His wife had died. You can't help being a homemaker. And yet she was surprised that Nick had gone to the store only twice in their entire married life. And that was when she was in the hospital or in a sanatorium. "And can I call you?" suddenly asked John, and smiled. "Do you need broth?" Immediately he became younger. His eyes became kind with a squint. Vanessa just nodded. Unaccustomed, of course. She sensed that they were both embarrassed like schoolboys, and clearly liked each other. "What are you making up?" Resentfully Vanessa fought off that thought. What other sympathy could there be? It's just that it's on friendly terms. She realized it wasn't friendly. There was a warmth flowing between them, as if an invisible fire had been lit to hide the awkwardness. She quickly took out a pot and set the broth to boil. John sat Vanessa in a chair and began to stir the morsels again. "Did you take your medication?" he asked worriedly. Vanessa nodded. Her cheeks blushed. "Good, we can write it off as a fever." "I feel better now, John." "John, call me John." the man asked briefly. Vanessa looked carefully at his face. John didn't look away. Calm and open. Okay, she'd give it a try. But how unusual. John dominated the kitchen as if he had always lived here. Vanessa was a little shy. That's how a guest is greeted by the hostess, sitting with her arms folded, and he does everything himself, but while it's cooking. I think you'd better lie down. You need to conserve your strength, John said. And grabbing a mug of Mars, headed for the room. Vanessa gave him a surprised look and followed. All the next day she remembered how John, sitting on a chair by her bed, told her where he had been born, how they had traveled all over the country for their military father, how they had lived in garrisons, then brought her a deep bowl of golden broth and a plate with toasted cubes of white bread. Vanessa looked up. You need to eat, too, don't you? I'm home. John waved his wife away. He left, and Vanessa thought for a long time about his kind eyes and care, which he bought her in just 2 days. I realized that it was from his side just help to a lonely sick person purely on humanity, and still dreamed that he would invite her, for example, to the movies. But John never came to see her again. He only called once more to ask about her health, and that was all. Vanessa was angry at herself, drew pictures that someone else needed her, that only people like Lucy were needed. The sick leave was closed. Vanessa went to work. During her illness, she had so many things to do that there was no time to think about all sorts of silly things. And after another week, Vanessa ran into the children's world in the evening to buy a birthday present for her daughter Nina's Twig. And while looking at the big-eyed, curly-haired dolls, she saw John. He was standing by the racks of board games and scrutinizing the boxes. Vanessa almost jumped, and her heart raced with joy. She wanted to just walk over to him as suddenly a young rouse-haired woman was beside John, who smiled and took him under her arm. Vanessa stepped back and hid behind the shelves. Tears came to her eyes. Dream on, you fool. Nick was right. Who's gonna look at her? A man helped her once, and she's already married to him. She left the store without buying a present, got on the streetcar, and stared sadly out the window. The woman next to John was so happy, very young, and he smiled and looked at her with tenderness. He must have many women like that. He is a free man, can afford to. John called her the next day. Vanessa, hello. Sorry about the rush. I didn't have time to stop by. How are you recovering? Vanessa cringed at his fake concern. No shame, no conscience. The man's doing fine. John. Dryly, she replied. I'm sorry, I don't have time to talk right now. I understand. John's voice sounded puzzled. I'll call you back later then. No, almost shouted Vanessa. No need to call here again. Vanessa. I don't understand anything that happened. I just wanted to say what, but Vanessa hung up the phone. The phone immediately rang again. She spun the wheel, sideways, and turned down the sound. She wouldn't talk to this man for anything. She'd had enough of the deception. Her sad face flashed in the mirror. She'd rather be alone all her life than believe and then settle and suffer. Nick walked to work annoyed. Once again, Lucy had been cranky and crying since early morning. This time she was upset because he ate apple. She wanted to grate it into cottage cheese for breakfast. It's no big deal, an apple. He always ate the fruit Vanessa brought him, and she never said a word. Only smiled at his health. Nick, what a mess. Nick thought with irritation as he walked to the bus stop. It was slippery from the dark sky. A nasty frost was falling and all his clothes seemed damp. Because of the straight from the corner air, the mood was spoiled completely. The bus was delayed again. Nick pulled his hat deeper over his ears and thought, the first euphoria of being with Lucy is gone. It wasn't much of one. It was a living thing, to be honest. Lucy spent more and more time lying on the couch, reading magazines and sleeping, watching TV. There were always plates, apple slices, crumbs, and uneaten tea in the room. Nick came home from work tired and hungry. But Lucy only lazily waved her hand in the direction of the refrigerator. Their cutlets from the cookhouse have Greek or dumplings. Nick was angry, grumbling. And then Lucy rounded dull blue eyes and trembled her lips pitifully. Don't you realize that in my position it's not good for me to worry? I don't feel well. I can't stand at the stove. She hardly ever went to the museum, taking sick days all the time. And Nick had to spend practically his entire paycheck. It was unusual for him. Vanessa used to take care of all the household expenses, and he could put money aside for a deposit. Every day she reminded him that it was time to go to the registry office. He promised, but still procrastinated, as if it would make a difference. Finally, they applied. Lucy brought a certificate from the women's clinic, and they were signed quickly. On the way back, she drove pouty, unhappy. So much for the white dress party. And you. And here everything is ordinary, as if not married, and went to the canteen. Sometimes she wondered who she was pregnant with. One day she was walking down the street with Nick, and suddenly she saw Ethan coming out of the store. His red hair was shining in the sun. I stopped like a stumbling block, turned away, and immediately pulled Nick to a stop. Oh, I feel dizzy. Come sit on the bench. Ethan didn't see her, ran right past her. Maybe he wouldn't even recognize me. Lucy thought sadly, cautiously glancing in his direction. Everything seemed to have worked out well, and there was a husband, and the apartment was bright and warm, and she was expecting a baby, but her heart felt empty. It turned out that seeing Nick occasionally wasn't the same as living together. All the romance and novelty was gone. Nick threw his things everywhere, especially his socks. Lucy would put them on with her foot, and from soccer, she'd nod toward the bathtub. I'm not going to mess around in soapy water, she coined at Nick's requests to wash his shirt. Buy a washing machine. I had to buy one, but it didn't help. Lucy never did the laundry. I'm allergic to powder, and then it's bad for the baby. She calmly told her husband. Now on Saturdays, instead of going to the garages with the men, Nick would do the laundry. Things got tangled up or new and looked old. Worn rags should be given to the laundry. Lucy advised gently, under beer and nails they do good laundry there. Nick couldn't imagine what the house would be like when the baby came. His whole life now is a series of whimsical tears and ultimatums. He became jumpy, and even on the road, he would get irritated at other drivers or a long burning red light. With sadness, I remembered how he used to walk home as a baron, also snorting. If Vanessa did not manage to serve dinner on time, angry at himself for these thoughts chased them away, but invariably came back time after time. He could not admit that he was better off with Faith, so he tried to convince himself that Lucy would change with time. And everything will learn, and just. It's such a period end. But himself and grinned heart told him that Lucy will never be a good hostess. All right, Nick consoled himself, but she would give me a son. But that argument didn't inspire him either. If he had been offered a new life with Vanessa, and no children or with Lucy but with a child, he would probably have chosen the former. For Vanessa, he was like a child himself. With Lucy, the question is, when will the son be born? Wouldn't she drift away? Wouldn't Nick move not even to the second, but to the 10th plan? And Lucy looked at her round belly and comforted herself with the fact that all babies are born with the same face. And Nick doesn't pay much attention. And even if the baby isn't his, he'll never notice. And then the plan to take Lucy's mother's child away after a year was not abandoned. Let it grow up there in the fresh air, and she'll stay here with Nick and no more children. And she'd take care of that. And so the two of them lived, thinking that in the future everything would somehow get better. And the present rushed by day by day, day by day. John looked thoughtfully out of the window, where the snow was falling all day long. Vanya, will you take this suit with you? He turned around. In the doorway stood Daria and held a hanger with a brown suit in her hand. Were the gray eyes watching? Concerned. No, Daria. Where am I going? One is enough for meetings. The rest of the time, I'm in special clothes. Clothes are better, okay. Anyway, I'm all packed. Daria turned to leave, but caught John's sad look. She stopped. Vanya, is something wrong with you? You're not yourself, are you? Or are you worried about Slavic? Don't worry, he won't obey his own aunt. Daria, Pearl had his arms at his sides and frowned jokingly. John laughed at him. His niece is already as tall as you, and you're only a few years older than him. Daria smiled and came to John, took his hand and leaned her head on his shoulder. Vanya, you drive safely. Okay, we'll manage, I don't doubt it. Dasha quietly said John and kissed her hair. Daria stood for another minute and rushed to the kitchen again. There was a distinct smell of baked goods in the air. John turned back to the window again. He couldn't forget Vanessa's icy, damp gust of wind, her indifference, and then her demand that he not call again. So it seemed to him that she was not indifferent to him, that she was a man, that she was glad to see him and accept his help. What was he fantasizing? But for the first time in 5 years, he felt such warmth, such closeness and kinship. And now he was wrong. Offended and bitter. Vanya, come and drink tea. I heard Dasha's sonorous voice. John snapped out of his gloomy thoughts. Daria, his little sister, born when his parents were in their 40s. The way he and his middle brother had cared for her, protected her, cherished her, and loved her. It is a pity. Peter, the brother, died, crashed on a motorcycle, and so still would pick up Dasha as a cannon oka and circled above the ground, and around the crystal bell would develop her laughter. Those were happy times. How did his fragile little sister support him when Helen died? She did not cry, though she loved her very much and comforted John and Slavik as much as she could. And now, when it turned out that she had to go on a business trip for 2 months, she came immediately to be with Slavik for that time. But she could have refused. She's so beautiful, she has so many suitors, and everyone wants to invite her to the movies or to the theater. But she decided to turn into a mother for 2 months, so that her nephew would be taken care of and always fed and filled with his diary. John scratched his forehead with his finger. He talked to Slavik in a manly, serious way and without jokes. He instructed him not to be Loboda to take care of his young Aunt Dasha, and not to make her nervous for trifles. I'm counting on you, Liam, I hope, he said, looking into his son's eyes. Well, Dad, he was embarrassed when I let you down, and yet my heart wasn't in the right place. But it was all from the fact that he could not tell Vanessa where he was going, and how much and why he would not be able to visit again. He hadn't expected not to be listened to. Could it be that she was thinking of going back to her husband? Or maybe it was just that John, wasn't her type. It's confusing. How strange. Still, they'll try calling again in a week. What if Vanessa could explain it all? Then it would be clear whether he had a chance to get the attention of this beautiful woman with kind, gray eyes. The next day, the train would take him to the city, where he would be alone for 2 months. It would be nice if he could write Vanessa a letter from there, and she would answer him. That would make the time pass faster and warm his heart. And Vanessa tried to live her life as usual. Sometimes she thought of going far away to another town, so that no one would know who she was and what had happened in her life, so that the streets and houses would not remind her of her youth and dates with Nick, so that she would not be afraid to see Lucy with the big round belly. But it was scary how completely alone she was there and how not to see. Nina not being in her warm home. It's hard, all of this. Again, she thought of John. Maybe she was wrong not to talk to him. And on the other hand, to make her hear, Nick also said a lot of things, made excuses, carried flowers, looked with doggy eyes, but in fact continued to run to Lucy, and even made a baby for her in front of her eyes. There were tears immediately, and Vanessa strenuously pretended that she was just sneezing from the dust. One evening, as she closed the door of the archives, she ran into Michael in the hallway. He was standing at attention like a soldier before a general, a shy hopefulness in his eyes. Vanessa, good evening. I know you've been avoiding me, but perhaps you'll agree to go to the theater on Saturday? It's a very interesting production, and I'm sure you've heard the actors are famous, and I've got 2 tickets. Michael did indeed hold 2 white rectangles in his hand. Vanessa was confused. She had explained everything to him. But Michael looked at her so politely and hopefully that she didn't have the courage to refuse. I didn't want to offend him, and it was flattering that he was so insistent on her attention. Well, Michael smiled at Vanessa. Let's go. Not expecting such an answer, Michael blushed with embarrassment. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Vanessa. I'm so glad you said yes then. 6:00 p.m. at the theater. Vanessa nodded and, saying goodbye, hurried to the exit. Michael remained standing in the corridor, looking after her. Vanessa walked quickly down the street and could not understand why she had agreed to meet Michael. She just wanted to see an interesting play. She talked herself into it. It's not like it's a date, even if it was. If Michael wasn't younger than her, maybe she'd marry him. A passing bus almost spears her, sprouting snow. Vanessa barely had time to dodge. "You're going to get married," she grinned. "Who called you?" She crossed the road. She went to the store. She wanted to buy some cookies for her evening tea. She and Katya would sit under a cozy lampshade. They'll make fragrant tea and talk. The old lady talks so fascinatingly about French artists. It's fascinating. The mood got a little better. She bought a whole bag of sweets and went outside. Suddenly, she was frozen in place, and Nick was walking towards her, Lucy, and it was impossible to hide or run away. Vanessa bravely looked her ex-husband in the face, but Lucy tried not to pay attention. Nick coughed and averted his eyes, and Lucy quickened her intense grimace and pressed herself more closely against his elbow. "Hello, Vanessa." Nick said a muffled hello. "Yes, hello," Vanessa replied and tried to step around the couple. "How are you?" Nick kept up. "Good," smiled Vanessa. "Better than ever." "Sorry, I'm in a hurry," grabbed from over the railing and started downstairs. She didn't see Nick turn around and look after her. "Can't we go in a cranky tone?" asked Lucy. Tugged Nick by the sleeve. He sighed, took another look around, and walked into the store. And Vanessa hurried home to tea, to Aunt Katya, to warmth, to her room where she can get away from everyone, and to think again of what might have been if she hadn't seen John with the young woman in the children's world. And John was surrounded by a Vanishnitsa of affairs. From the plant, he was allocated a service one-room apartment, where he was to live for 2 whole months. The dwelling was absolutely bachelor uncomfortable, but he's not used to it. The main thing is a sofa, a refrigerator, and hot water. He'll only come here for the night anyway. The factory is launching a new workshop, so there's a lot of work to do. And yet, falling on his pillow at night, he had time to think every time. And yesterday his eyes and a woman was soft, thick, like a mermaid's hair. He hoped he would dream about her, but usually by morning he couldn't even remember if he dreamt anything or not. He never dared to call her. He was afraid. What if she told him not to bother her again? At least there was hope. He'd come back, buy a fancy bouquet, and go straight to her. And then she won't be able to just hang up. She'll have to talk. On weekends, John would call home, wondering about Slavik's progress, asking Dasha if he'd done anything wrong. But his sister always said that everything was fine and she didn't complain about her nephew. John rejoiced, but he still dreamed of being free soon and returning to his son. Or maybe he was drawn not only to his son. A month passed. Every day John had the same in the morning tea with sandwiches, then the factory shop, planning meetings, commissions, approvals, lunch in the canteen. Then dinner and an uncomfortable sofa in the apartment where dozens of business travelers had lived before him. That fateful day was also usual until lunch. After it was scheduled to check the equipment, and John ate unpalatable borscht and cutlets with buckwheat, went to the shop. Gradually gathered everyone who had to put their signatures in the acts. They were in no hurry. There was enough time till evening. And the work was going according to plan. John and a few other engineers crowded around one of the machines of the new equipment. Everyone was curious to see how it would perform in operation. Around rumbled and sang mechanisms, hustled workers. Sheets of iron fixed on screens floated overhead. John looked for the shop foreman with his eyes and saw him hurrying toward them, checking a pile of papers in his hands as he went, answering a question from one of the workers, and Then John decided to walk over to the outermost machine for a second to make sure that the workers had not forgotten to install the protective cover. Suddenly, he heard a piercing scraping sound from above, and he managed to raise his head and noticed the dream. One of the iron, showing with a few seconds the load slid even harder on one side. At that moment, a young lad emerged from behind the machine. He ran straight under the crane and stared curiously at the impending collapse of the structure. Before John knew it, he was rushing toward the boy and pushing him aside. The noise of the machines overlapped the wild rumbling, and down came the crashing. Not only sheets of iron flew down, but also beams, thin and thick pipes, and metal rods. One of these bars struck John on the back. A bright flash of pain, and he fell to the ground. There was only darkness from then on. Many hundreds of kilometers away from the shop, for some reason, they were tied with an iron hoop. In the heart of a woman with gray eyes. She stood on a stepladder, his inferior dusty folders with documents. When she felt how badly she felt in her soul, as if something had happened. Startled, she slid down pale, threw the folders on the table and leaned on it with her hands. Her heart was telling her like a frightened sparrow to call Nina. Or what if Aunt Katya was bad? Or had something happened to Kolya? Or maybe it was just the pressure from the morning headache. That's why all sorts of horrible things are happening. Vanessa dialed a friend. Talked to her husband. He assured her that everything was fine. Then she called Aunt Kate. Everyone was fine. You never know what might have happened to Nick. Was it for the best that he had someone to take care of him now? With a slight sadness, the thought of John floated through. Why? Who knows? I can't get that man out of my heart, even though I've forbidden myself to think about him 100 times. He made me think he didn't need her much. He never called again. Then I scolded myself that he himself asked for it, in the end waved goodbye, and tried to just live on. Going to the theater with Mikhail once again confirmed that relationships built on pity, impossible. He came with flowers, and sat through the whole performance looking not at the stage, but at Vanessa. She was embarrassed. She tried not to turn her head. At intermission, Michael offered to drink champagne. Vanessa declined. They stood in awkward silence waiting for the third bell to ring. After the performance, Michael decided to see Vanessa off. I had to agree. But she flatly refused to take a cab. We rode in a half-empty trolleybus and were silent again. He seemed to be a good and clever man, and he looked at her like a deity. But she had no heart for him. I can't even cry. I can't stop thinking. Wouldn't it be nice to go to the theater with John? I wish John would ask me to hold his hand. And he wouldn't ask. He would just take her frozen palm in his wide, warm palm. And that's all. Vanessa heard the sharp voice of the superintendent behind her. I've been waiting for the documents for an hour. Vanessa snapped to attention. With all her worries and memories flew off to nowhere. She took the folders with the pads, which were tied from time, and apologizing, hurried to the office. In the evening, the headache returned. Vanessa popped a pill and only dreamed of getting home sooner and early, going to bed. Even the traditional tea parties with Aunt Katya would be skipped today. There's no strength for that. The main thing is not to fall apart again. Aunt Kate didn't insist. She nodded her head sympathetically. She sent her to her room, but she was still impatient, and brought a cup of fresh emergency tea with mint. Drink it, Vanessa, you'll get there faster. Vanessa tangled herself in the stove, touched it. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Neighbor Kate thought through a shot she is in the hallway. Muffled female voices sounded. One voice seemed too young, not like her neighbor. Vanessa looked up, and just as the door was ajar, Vanessa, Aunt Kate's whisper sounded. Are you asleep? There's someone here to see you. Vanessa was surprised. Who is she? Dropped her feet off the bed. Aunt Kate shrugged and disappeared into the hallway. Vanessa put on her slippers and, inviting in her hair, left the room. Standing in the hallway was the young woman Vanessa had seen with John in the store. Her face was pale and showed only huge gray eyes with near alarm and terror in them. Are you here to see me? Yes, swiked the girl, you are Vanessa. Vanessa nodded. She had no way of knowing why John's date had shown up here. What did she want? Vanessa, I don't know who else to turn to. My coworkers can help, of course, but I don't know what else to do. Help me, please. The girl sobbed confusedly. Wait, confused Vanessa. I don't understand anything. Who are you? Me? I'm Daria. Vanya had an accident. He's in the hospital. The doctors are scaring him. I don't know what to do. They say he may remain immobile. Vanessa leaned with her back against the wall and folded her arms on her chest. And you, Daria, so you don't need an invalid husband. But why did you come to me? How did you know my address? Daria's eyes reddened. Tears glistened. I found the address on a piece of paper. And actually, I'm sorry, I must have made a mistake, I'm sorry. Daria turned around and started twisting the lock, trying to open it. Her movements were nervous, and a blush spread across her cheeks. Vanessa felt embarrassed to attack the man. She had asked for help. Excuse me, please. Let's go to the kitchen. I'll pour you some tea. You'll tell me everything, otherwise I don't understand anything. Daria looked carefully into Vanessa's face. Then she hesitantly began to unwind her scarf. Aunt Kate rushed over to help her. She hung up her coat, ran to the kitchen, put the kettle on, shook her head, and disappeared into the room. I didn't want to embarrass her with my presence. Little did the two women have to talk about. Maybe not exactly pleasant things to discuss. Trouble. Oh, the trouble had come in a way no one could wish. Did he, like Vanessa, turn pale when he heard about it? Let them talk. The main thing is that John gets well. He's a good man. That was clear even from Vanessa's short story. She likes him. Vanessa is waiting for him. She poured tea, looked at Dasha, sat on them like a bird. A few mucus flew off her eyelashes. The girl quickly wiped them with the back of her palm. Would you like some jam? Daria? Vanessa asked softly. Daria sighed convulsively and shook her head. No, Vanessa, thank you. I am. She took a cautious sip and sighed again. Vanessa sat down across from her. John, my older brother, Vanessa pronounced Daria. She raised her wet eyes and looked at Vanessa. There were 3 of us. John is the oldest, then Peter, then me. I'm much younger, born late, and John's special. They were always there for me. Daria sobbed again and, hugging her mug with her palms, looked past Vanessa to the wall. And then Peter died, crashed his motorcycle, and left me and my parents with John alone. And if something happens to him, I don't know what we'll all do, notwithstanding. Daria burst into tears. Vanessa jumped up, rushed to her. She cradled her head against her soft belly, stroked her hair, and bit her lip. God, what a fool she was. How could she tell that girl about an invalid husband? What a stupid woman, Daria cried. So bitterly. Vanessa's heart was breaking with pity. She kept stroking her head and waited patiently for the girl to calm down. Finally, Daria fell silent. Oh, she said, I'm sorry. It's okay, Daria. It's nothing. Come pray, and we'll think together what to do now. Aunt Kate came out of the room. With her eyes, she asked if she needed help. But Vanessa shook her head and pulled Dasha into the bathroom. Then they sat in the kitchen for a long time. The tea had long since gone cold. No one was interested in it. Vanessa listened to Dasha attentively, a little frowning. Smooth, bushy eyebrows. I would have gone there to the hospital, but I have Slavic. I haven't told him, and I haven't told my parents. They couldn't take it. They both have weak hearts. My dad had a heart attack 2 years ago. And it's right not to tell them yet, Vanessa said. Then say, it'll get better. The danger will pass. And say you think he'll get better. A completely childish hope. Daria asked, raising her tearful eyes to Vanessa. Of course he will, Vanessa replied with tears in her eyes. It couldn't be otherwise. He is a strong man, and the doctors will put him on his feet. They sat in the kitchen for a long time. Daria gradually calmed down, although the anxiety in her eyes had not disappeared. She told with a smile about John, about his difficult fate, about the loss of his wife, whom he loved very much. Told her about him, how much he loved fame and care, how he had never gone on a single date in 5 years, and they had all decided he would stay that way now forever, alone. Before he left, we were talking. Daria looked Vanessa in the eye, and he told me a little bit about you. And you know, when he spoke, his face became, she hesitated, choosing the words, as luminous as it had been when Helen was alive. You'll excuse me, please. It must be unpleasant for you. Scared, Daria? No, that you smiled, Vanessa, on the contrary. And I'm so embarrassed. He called me. He probably wanted to warn me that he was going away for a long time. And Vanessa lowered her eyes. And you echoed. Daria interrogated. And me? I was angry with him and didn't speak. And she also asked me to never call again. Vanessa didn't look at her sister John, picked at the customer on the table with her finger, berating herself for being afraid to talk, to find out everything. Maybe then John wouldn't have been so upset and would have been more careful. Maybe it would have kept him safe. Soon Doria was on his way home. "Call me tomorrow," Vanessa asked. "If you hear anything, call me anytime, both here and at work. Promise me and I'll call you." "Yes, of course, Vanessa." Vanessa, just Vanessa. Doria nodded and ran down the stairs. Vanessa stayed standing at the open door, as if she hoped Doria would come back. If she wanted to, she would tell her that she and John had played a trick on her. "Vanessa, Squirt, would you come inside, please?" Aunt Kate appeared behind her. Vanessa obeyed, locking the door. She sank heavily onto a stool in the hallway. "What to do now? Are you an aunt, Kate?" she asked and looked helplessly at the old woman. "You have to go, Vanessa. Go to him. Don't you see? Do you need each other? Stop running, and he will feel that you are near, and he will have strength for tomorrow." Vanessa asked for a leave of absence without pay. She called Dasha, found out which hospital John was in. She picked up her suitcase and rushed to the train station, just to be on time, just to be near him. I had no doubts, no fear. He would be cured, put on his feet, and never be given to anyone else. I went straight from the station to the hotel, left my things, and went to the hospital. "Who are you to him?" asked glumly and the nurse in the window of the information desk. I was confused, Vanessa me. Familiar information only to relatives next. Vanessa stepped aside confusedly. Doria stayed with the Slovaks, and no other relatives and no one else in the know. Flocks of students in white coats ran past, with skinny necks sticking out of their gates. Relatives of the sick handed over handouts. The cleaning lady was using a gray rag to clean Philia. The ordinary life of the hospital, where everything smelled of disease, fear, tears, and hope. A nurse with a disgruntled face came out of the cafeteria. She gazed into the pies, bought immediately from Yusuf, from one slid on Vanessa indifferent glance, Vanessa. It was as if it dawned on him. And where did the courage come from? She stepped towards the woman. "Hello, can you tell me, do you work here?" Nodded the nurse, munching on a trauma pie. Vanessa felt her heart jump. After all, that was where John was lying. She looked around and opened her purse, carefully pulled a bill out of her wallet and awkwardly, clasping it in her fist, said, "Help me, please. I need to know about the condition of the patient, but they won't tell me. And who are you?" The nurse's eyes lit up with curiosity. She even stopped chewing her pie for a while. The bride blushed, Vanessa replied. "I have a request for you." Vanessa grabbed the plump palm of the nurse and fell asleep with the paper. She smiled and deftly took the money out of Vanessa's hand without anyone noticing. "Can you find out how he is? And read him the note. I don't know if he's conscious or not, but you read it anyway, please." The nurse squinted her eyes, hopped the rest of the pie into her mouth, and wiped her greasy lips with her sleeve. "Okay, I'll find it. It's not hard for me to write." She turned away delicately. Vanessa took out a small notebook and a pen. She carefully scribbled in ink, wrote a few lines, and carefully tore out a sheet of paper. She folded it 4 times and handed it to the nurse. She indifferently slipped the note into her pocket. "Wait." Vanessa recalled the name and surname once more and stood by the sideboard. She glanced at the transparent display cases of pies, sandy rings behind the display case, a sausage sandwich. Above it all towered the white hood of the barmaid with a howl, glasses rattling, spoons and metal served. But Vanessa did not want to eat or drink. She was very tired from the road, from the excitement, from worrying about John. A thought flashed through her mind that maybe it was a mistake to come here, but it was gone. Her heart told her it was the right decision. "Woman here." Vanessa flinched and turned around. Had she noticed how much time had passed? The orderly had returned and was now standing directly in front of her, touching her sleeve. "I found your John lying there. The professors are waiting. The concilium will be important," she said. Vanessa did not immediately realize what was going to happen. And only after a minute she guessed that the orderly, so from the mirror of the word concilium. "He is conscious, understands everything. I read him the note. He gave you the answer here. I wrote it down." She reached into her pocket and took out a theatrical sheet where something was written indecipherable in crooked letters. "Thank you." Vanessa thanked him quietly and stepped aside. "I will also be here tomorrow from 4 in the afternoon. My name is Sony. Ask anyone to call Sanja, and I'll come out. What's your name?" The nurse, Vanessa, wouldn't stop. "I'll come. I'll be there tomorrow." The woman nodded. She gracefully shouted at the student and headed for the stairs. Vanessa unfolded the sheet with trembling fingers. John informed her that he was very happy to see her and did not even immediately believe that she was the one who asked him not to worry and not to worry. Said that he was almost all right and would be well soon. Assured him that now that he knew Vanessa was there for him, he would try to get back on his feet faster. And that was it. No mention of prognosis, of his condition, of how much help he needed. But Vanessa was glad for this message too. She walked through the crooked streets of a town she didn't know and ran the words John over and over in her head, learning them by heart. She wandered off in the opposite direction from the hospital and found herself on the outskirts, where private wooden houses stood. Barking or dogs smoked from the smoke of brick chimneys, and in some places even the cries of roosters could be heard. Almost a village, and then at the very edge where the road turned to the country highway, Vanessa came upon a little white church. She stopped as if staring at the dark cross at the top. Suddenly it was as if some force pushed her in the back. Vanessa took another step and walked toward the stone building. She didn't even think about whether it was open or not, just walked as if someone was calling her. She pushed open the wooden door, stepped inside, and found herself in the semi-darkness. There was no one else inside. Vanessa stopped timidly at the entrance. She didn't know any prayers. In Versailles, candles from icons looked stern faces of saints. Framed in her shawl, she raised her head, closed her eyes, and began to whisper a single request. "Let John be well. Let John be well." Tears flowed down her cheeks. She felt better. Vanessa stood for a moment longer and went outside. For 2 weeks, Vanessa went to the hospital every day calling Aunt Sonia or her friend Daniel. At first, she sent only notes, and then some groceries. She got answers with rosy cheeks, reading every line. And once she was handed a leaf on which John wrote a few lines of happiness. She pressed it to her chest. "It means he's on the mend." Not everything turned out to be so terrible. But one day, Aunt Sonia even managed to organize a meeting with the attending doctor, who briefly but clearly told about the patient's condition. "We can't promise anything," he said lastly, "but there is always hope for a favorable outcome. Wait, pray, believe." And Vanessa believed. She called Dashi, gave her first-hand news. She became very friendly and close to her sister John. She even wanted to tell her about her, but Vanessa asked not to. She did not think about the future with John at all. She only cared about the present, to get better. And then whatever would happen, even if she just had to go back to the room. The day came at Aunt Kate's apartment when she was allowed to visit John in the rooming house. Vanessa worried as schoolgirl Danilovna led her down the long hallways, pushed open the tiny white door. Vanessa looked at it fearfully and bravely stepped inside. There were only 2 beds in the room, and she immediately saw John badly shaved. He was lying on his back. "He'll stay like this for at least 2 weeks. Then he will try to walk a little." The doctors didn't give much hope, but they didn't give up on the patient either. "Everything depends on him," said the elderly doctor with bony eyebrows. "The main thing is not to fall into despondency. And of course, work, discipline and exercise." "Vanessa, at last," John said quietly with a smile. His eyes glistened with joy. Vanessa came closer and sat on the chair by the bed. "How are you, Van?" she asked simply. "Little by little we got out of it. The main thing is that you are here now. I will definitely get better." He took her hand. His fingers sank into her warm palm. Vanessa blushed from the neighboring bunk. A man whose leg was hanging up was looking at them good-naturedly. "Daria and Slavik are doing well," said Vanessa to hide Slavik's embarrassment. "Only yesterday she said that you have a small injury and your parents don't know." "That's right," replied John. "There's no need to worry them. I'll stop and visit them on my own feet." Vanessa looked at him sadly, if only it were so. "Vanessa, Just don't go. Okay. There was so much hope and tenderness in his voice that Vanessa felt a lump in her throat. I won't leave, Vanya, I won't. You just get better quickly. 3 weeks later, a man and a woman entered the train carriage. The man carefully moved his legs, holding a special support, and the woman applied nearby, ready at any moment to rush to his aid. Here the man woke up, and the woman rushed to him to support him. But he waved his head, stubbornly pressed his lips, and himself slowly went further. Carefully, Van was all Vanessa could utter. Doctors allowed to return home, but asked to be careful, immediately go to the polyclinic at the place of residence, to continue physical therapy, and to go to the sanatorium. John nodded, almost without listening. He was eager to leave the hospital and finally see his family. Vanessa did not leave his side. The money left was very young, and the vacation at your own expense could not be extended either. It was time to go back. Before leaving, she ran into the small church again and thanked the higher powers for helping John not to become a cripple. Let not be crippled with pains, but still a man on his own feet. You're lucky, son. Not a wife, but gold, said John to an old woman on her way to the side. She had been watching them for a long time, noting with what care Vanessa treated him. You take care of her. I am, John replied earnestly, without taking a break, but looking at Vanessa, who, smiling, was walking towards him at the station, met Daria and Slavik. The long, thin boy with gray eyes immediately hugged his father. Vanessa noticed how his eyes became hard. Then Slavik looked at her in embarrassment, picked up his bag. Liam, this is Vanessa, John said simply. This is the nice person I helped over the winter, and now she's helped me too. Vanessa worriedly waited to see what the skinny teenager would say. Slavik looked carefully and seriously into her face and smiled slightly. Vanessa looked back at John, who winked. I told you everything would be all right. Daria talked nonstop, telling her how well Liam was doing in school and how peaceful they had lived all this time. She caught her brother's gaze, frightened silence when he wrinkled his nose slightly. Unevenly, admittedly, and anxiously, she looked at Vanessa. But Vanessa was calm and centered, and Daria was beginning to feel more confident. How grateful was she to this kind woman? She couldn't have done it without her. She wouldn't have made it. It would have been bad for her and her nephew, and now things would get better. John will get stronger, and he's tough, he can do it. Especially now he has Vanessa. Daria looked at her brother with a sly smile. Saw the way he looked at Vanessa, the warmth in his eyes. It had been a long time since she had seen such a thing. Only once had she seen such eyes in Vanja's eyes when his Helen was around. Worried that Liam felt no, there was no son. He saw how his father had changed too. Liam is a smart and kind guy. He won't condition his father himself to try out yesterday. I've been thinking about Aunt Vanessa. I don't mind if they get married. Dasha was immediately relieved from her soul, and her heart was pouring out. Vanya, she squinted slyly. Do you know that I bought your favorite cakes? Do you know what line I stood in? All four of them laughed merrily, and the passers-by turned around surprised and approvingly. And Vanessa clung tighter to John. Surprisingly, even now, when he was not completely healthy, she felt like a stone wall around him and knew that he loved her. No loud words are needed. A gentle look, a light touch is enough. And the feeling as if there was no one in her life but Vanya. Everything was forgotten and disappeared in a haze. Only this man remained, the most beloved and dear. Vanessa used to think it could not happen like that. Turns out it does, almost like in the books. Not for nothing. She mistook Nick for him, but fate put everything in its place. And Vanessa met John, and now she has a son, even if he wasn't born to her, but he is. How did you know, Vanessa, that they are soulmates, and therefore they will always be together from now on? The summer was hot, without rain. Everything floated quietly. The asphalt was lazily sowed in style by trees burnt by dusty leaves, and exhausted people with red faces crawled along the sidewalks. Nick stood at the open window and looked up at the sky. The weather forecasters had mentioned in passing that it might rain today, but the sky continued to shine with a clear dove as if in mockery. Not a single cloud in the night. The ambulance took Lucy to the maternity ward. It seemed a little early. He thought she still had a month to go, but that's just the way it is. He called the information desk this morning. He was told that his spouse had not yet given birth. He'd have to wait. Nick scratched his stubbled chin. He wanted to drink a cold beer, but he couldn't, in case he had to go to Lucy's. He realized that he probably wouldn't see her today, not even in the window, but he still wouldn't let himself open the fridge and take out a bottle of wine. He was worried, of course, though happy. His new family life can't be called, and tortured him during the pregnancy Lucy so many caprices and tantrums. He himself was already counting the days until the birth longingly. He looked around the room. It was a mess. Everything was scattered, dust everywhere. He should clean it up, or he'd bring his son to such filth. He's got 5 days at his disposal. Should he ask his neighbor? He remembered how clean the apartment was when Vanessa lived here. How is she now? Would it all go back? Vaguely. But in his soul, there was already a suspicion that now he would have to endure not only Lucy's tears and reproaches, but also the cries of the baby and dirty diapers, and running to the milk kitchen. Nick sighed noisily. For some reason, even the thought of a baby did not make him happy. Maybe he just wasn't used to it yet. Lucy kept saying that in a year she would send the baby to her mother. He'll be better off there. You and me, we're not old yet. We need to live for ourselves. We'll go to a resort by the sea. I'll regain my figure in a year, and then we'll go. Do you know what swimsuit Svetka promised me? Nick was silent. He didn't like what Lucy said about his son, as if he were a puppy or a kitten he played with and gave him away. That's not right. It's not right. But in his cowardly way, he didn't say anything about it. And Lucy nodded contentedly, saying, "Let's do it that way. If you agree." By evening, the information desk reported that Lucy had given birth to a girl without a good growth, that it was necessary to scream. Nick sat down on a stool. The girl, what about the son, listened to himself. No joy, no excitement, as if he didn't have a child anymore. 4 more days later, he went to the discharge. Lucy came out pale with blue circles under her eyes. "Sucked everything out of me like a pump," grudgingly muttered she, accepting flowers from her husband burned standing up. Shouting and yelling at the Arabs, Nick took a roll-up with a pink bow in his arms, carefully opened a corner of the lace, saw the tiny button at the bow, and clenched tightly and the eyes with long, light red lashes. It looked like a doll, and only at home. When Lucy took off the girl's bonnet, he saw a little leading fiery red hair and stared perplexedly at his wife. "What are you looking at?" Angrily squinted his eyes. "Lucy. Well, redhead. My grandmother was like that, so I went to her kin." Nick looked incredulously at his daughter, then back at Lucy, but she turned away indifferently. She hoped he hadn't guessed anything from her face. She herself, when she first saw the little girl, almost fainted. When she realized who the father was, she was afraid that black-haired Nick wouldn't believe her. So she made up a story about her grandmother. How's he gonna check it out? He can't. And she's not gonna raise her daughter anyway, so she won't bother Nick. And whether she grows up a redhead or runs around even multicolored, it doesn't matter. At the end of September, Nick was walking down the street, pushing a stroller in front of him. Lucy had gone to bed, and he and his daughter were put outside by the blue-eyed redhead. Cindy advised firmly in a leather envelope. Every day, Nick gazed at her face and kept looking for something in it that might remind him of his features. It seemed to him that the fingers on her hands were similar, or her nose. But more and more often he realized that he only wanted to convince himself of this. But his soul became bitter. He chased away the gloomy thoughts, but they were like annoying flies, and they kept coming into his head. He went out to the boulevard looking for a free bench. September was swirling with leaves, breathing fall, but not yet bored with rain and dampness. Nick walked slowly along the path past the flower beds, from which red and purple asters nodded their heads in greeting. I heard a dog barking, and then a big dog with light-colored hair and smart brown eyes came out of the trees toward me in a boyish voice. She stopped merrily with her tongue hanging out. Nick looked unhappily in the direction of its owner and froze in place at the bench with a flood in his hand stood a teenager. Next to him was a tall man who was holding the hand of a woman in the woman. Nick recognized Vanessa. She didn't notice him because she was only looking at her companion, and he had his arm around her waist. Nick could clearly see rounded tummy. The man's hand slid over it too. Vanessa laughed happily and leaned her head against his shoulder, knocking dry leaves over with her paws as she jumped up to them. The dog's tail wagging was bouncing. Vanessa rubbed the boy's head. Then they turned away, and all three of them walked slowly down the alley. Vanessa held on to the man's arm like that, as if she was afraid to fall behind. Nick stood and watched them for a long time, watching Cindy wail and cry in the stroller. Nick looked at her, gave her a pacifier, and from time to time, looking back, went down the alley.